The Bird's Christmas Carol by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 1. A Little Snowbird. It was very early Christmas morning, and in the stillness of the dawn, with the soft snow falling on the housetops, a little child was born in the Bird household. They had intended to name the baby Lucy, if it were a girl, but they hadn't expected her on Christmas morning, and a real Christmas baby was not to be lightly named. The whole family agreed in that. They were consulting about it in the nursery. Mr. Bird said that he had assisted in naming the 3 boys, and that he should leave this matter entirely to Mrs. Bird. Donald wanted the child called Maud, after a pretty little curly-haired girl who sat next him in school. Paul chose Luella, for Luella was the nurse who had been with him during his whole babyhood up to the time of his first trousers, and the name suggested all sorts of comfortable things. Uncle Jack said that the first girl should always be named for her mother, no matter how hideous the name happened to be. Grandma said she would prefer not to take any part in the discussion, and everybody suddenly remembered that Mrs. Bird had thought of naming the baby Lucy for Grandma herself, and while it would be indelicate for her to favor that name, it would be against human nature for her to suggest any other under the circumstances. Hugh, the hitherto baby, if that is a possible term, sat in one corner and said nothing, but felt in some mysterious way that his nose was out of joint, for there was a newer baby now, a possibility he had never taken into consideration, and the first girl, too, a still higher development of treason, which made him actually green with jealousy. But it was too profound a subject to be settled then and there, on the spot. Besides, Mamma had not been asked, and everybody felt it rather absurd, after all, to forestall a decree that was certain to be absolutely wise, just, and perfect. The reason that the subject had been brought up at so early in the day lay in the fact that Mrs. Bird never allowed her babies to go overnight unnamed. She was a person of so great decision of character that she would have blushed at such a thing. She said that to let blessed babies go dangling and dawdling about without names for months and months was enough to ruin them for life. She also said that if one could not make up one's mind in 24 hours, it was a sign that— but I will not repeat the rest, as it might prejudice you against the most charming woman in the world. So Donald took his new velocipede and went out to ride up and down the stone pavement and notched the shins of innocent people as they passed by, while Paul spun his musical top on the front steps. But Hugh refused to leave the scene of action. He seated himself on the top stair in the hall, banged his head against the railing a few times, just by way of uncorking the vials of his wrath, and then subsided into gloomy silence, waiting to declare war if more first girl babies were thrust upon a family already surfeited with that unnecessary article. Meanwhile, dear Mrs. Bird lay in her room, weak, but safe and happy with her sweet baby girl by her side, and the heaven of motherhood opening before her. Nurse was making gruel in the kitchen, and the room was dim and quiet. There was a cheerful open fire in the grate, but though the shutters were closed, the side windows that looked out on the Church of Our Savior next door were wide open. Suddenly a sound of music poured out into the bright air and drifted into the chamber. It was the boy choir singing Christmas anthems. Higher and higher rose the clear, fresh voices, full of hope and cheer, as children's voices always are. Fuller and fuller grew the burst of melody as one glad strain fell upon another in joyful harmony. Carol, brothers, carol, carol joyfully, carol the good tidings, carol merrily, and pray a gladsome Christmas for all your fellow men. Carol, brothers, carol, Christmas Day again. One verse followed another, always with the same glad refrain. And pray a gladsome Christmas for all your fellow men. Carol, brothers, carol, Christmas Day again. Mrs. Bird thought, as the music floated in upon her gentle sleep, that she had slipped into heaven with her new baby, and that the angels were bidding them welcome. But the tiny bundle by her side stirred a little, and though it was scarcely more than the ruffling of a feather, she awoke. For the mother ear is so close to the heart that it can hear the faintest whisper of a child. She opened her eyes and drew the baby closer. It looked like a rose dipped in milk, she thought, this pink and white blossom of girlhood, or like a pink cherub with its halo of pale yellow hair, finer than floss silk. Carol, brothers, carol, carol joyfully, carol the good tidings, carol merrily. The voices were brimming over with joy. "Why, my baby," whispered Mrs. Bird in soft surprise. "I had forgotten what day it was. You are a little Christmas child, and we will name you Carol, Mother's little Christmas Carol." "What?" said Mr. Bird, coming in softly and closing the door behind him. "Why, Donald, don't you think Carol is a sweet name for a Christmas baby? It came to me just a moment ago in the singing as I was lying here half asleep and half awake." "I think it is a charming name, dear heart, and that it sounds just like you, and I hope that, being a girl, this baby has some chance of being as lovely as her mother." At which speech from the baby's papa, Mrs. Bird, though she was as weak and tired as she could be, blushed with happiness. And so Carol came by her name. Of course, it was thought foolish by many people, though Uncle Jack declared laughingly that it was very strange if a whole family of birds could not be indulged in a single carol, and Grandma, who adored the child, thought the name much more appropriate than Lucy, but was glad that people would probably think it short for Caroline. Perhaps because she was born in holiday time, Carol was a very happy baby. Of course, she was too tiny to understand the joy of Christmastide, but people say there is everything in a good beginning, and she may have breathed in unconsciously the fragrance of evergreens and holiday dinners, while the peals of sleigh bells and the laughter of happy children may have fallen upon her baby ears and wakened in them a glad surprise at the merry world she had come to live in. Her cheeks and lips were as red as holly berries. Her hair was for all the world the color of a Christmas candle flame. Her eyes were bright as stars, her laugh like a chime of Christmas bells, and her tiny hands forever outstretched in giving. Such a generous little creature you never saw. A spoonful of bread and milk had always to be taken by Mamma or Nurse before Carol could enjoy her supper, and whatever bit of cake or sweetmeat found its way into her pretty fingers, it was straightway broken in half and shared with Donald, Paul, or Hugh, and when they made believe nibble the morsel with affected enjoyment, she would clap her hands and crow with delight. "Why does she do it?" asked Donald thoughtfully. "None of us boys ever did." "I hardly know," said Mamma, catching her darling to her heart, "except that she is a little Christmas child, and so she has a tiny share of the blessedest birthday the world ever saw." End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Bird's Christmas Carol by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 2. Drooping Wings. It was December, 10 years later. Carol had seen 9 Christmas trees lighted on her birthdays, one after another. 9 times she had assisted in the holiday festivities of the household, though in her babyhood her share of the gaieties was somewhat limited. For 5 years, certainly, she had hidden presents for Mama and Papa in their own bureau drawers, and harbored a number of secrets sufficiently large to burst the baby's brain, had it not been for the relief gained by whispering them all to Mama at night, when she was in her crib, a proceeding which did not in the least lessen the value of a secret in her innocent mind. For 5 years she had heard 'twas the night before Christmas, and hung up a scarlet stocking many sizes too large for her, and pinned a sprig of holly on her little white nightgown to show Santa Claus that she was a truly Christmas child, and dreamed of fur-coated saints and toy packs and reindeer, and wished everybody a Merry Christmas before it was light in the morning, and lent every one of her new toys to the neighbors' children before noon, and eaten turkey and plum pudding, and gone to bed at night in a trance of happiness at the day's pleasures. Donald was away at college now. Paul and Hugh were great manly fellows, taller than their mother. Papa Bird had gray hairs in his whiskers, and Grandma, God bless her, had been 4 Christmases in heaven. But Christmas in the bird's nest was scarcely as merry now as it used to be in the bygone years, for the little child that once brought such an added blessing to the day lay month after month, a patient, helpless invalid, in the room where she was born. She had never been very strong in body, and it was with a pang of terror her mother and father noticed, soon after she was 5 years old, that she began to limp, ever so slightly, to complain too often of weariness, and to nestle close to her mother, saying she would rather not go out to play, please. The illness was slight at first, and hope was always stirring in Mrs. Bird's heart. Carol would feel stronger in the summer-time, or she would be better when she had spent a year in the country, or she would outgrow it, or they would try a new physician. But by and by it came to be all too sure that no physician save one could make Carol strong again, and that no summer-time nor country air, unless it were the everlasting summer-time in a heavenly country, could bring back the little girl to health. The cheeks and lips that were once as red as holly berries faded to faint pink. The star-like eyes grew softer, for they often gleamed through tears, and the gay child laugh that had been like a chime of Christmas bells gave place to a smile so lovely, so touching, so tender and patient, that it filled every corner of the house with a gentle radiance that might have come from the face of the Christ child himself. Love could do nothing, and when we have said that, we have said all, for it is stronger than anything else in the whole wide world. Mr. and Mrs. Bird were talking it over one evening when all the children were asleep. A famous physician had visited them that day and told them that sometime, it might be in 1 year, it might be in more, Carol would slip quietly off into heaven whence she came. "Dear heart," said Mr. Bird, pacing up and down the library floor, "it is no use to shut our eyes to it any longer. Carol will never be well again. It almost seems as if I could not bear it when I think of that loveliest child doomed to lie there day after day, and what is still more, to suffer pain that we are helpless to keep away from her. Merry Christmas indeed. It gets to be the saddest day in the year to me." And poor Mr. Bird sank into a chair by the table and buried his face in his hands to keep his wife from seeing the tears that would come in spite of all his efforts. "But, Donald, dear," said sweet Mrs. Bird with trembling voice, "Christmas Day may not be so merry with us as it used, but it is very happy, and that is better, and very blessed, and that is better yet. I suffer chiefly for Carol's sake, but I have almost given up being sorrowful for my own. I am too happy in the child, and I see too clearly what she has done for us and for our boys." "That's true, bless her sweet heart," said Mr. Bird. "She has been better than a daily sermon in the house ever since she was born, and especially since she was taken ill." Yes, Donald and Paul and Hugh were 3 strong, willful, boisterous boys, but you seldom see such tenderness, devotion, thought for others, and self-denial in lads of their years. A quarrel or a hot word is almost unknown in this house. Why? Carol would hear it, and it would distress her. She is so full of love and goodness. The boys study with all their might and main. Why? Partly, at least, because they like to teach Carol and amuse her by telling her what they read. When the seamstress comes, she likes to sew in Miss Carol's room, because there she forgets her own troubles, which heaven knows are sore enough. As for me, Donald, I am a better woman every day for Carol's sake. I have to be her eyes, ears, feet, hands, her strength, her hope, and she, my own little child, is my example. "I was wrong, dear heart," said Mr. Bird more cheerfully. "We will try not to repine, but to rejoice instead that we have an angel of the house like Carol. And as for her future," Mrs. Bird went on, "I think we need not be over-anxious. I feel as if she did not belong altogether to us, and when she has done what God sent her for, He will take her back to Himself, and it may not be very long." Here it was poor Mrs. Bird's turn to break down, and Mr. Bird's turn to comfort her. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Bird's Christmas Carol by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 3. The Bird's Nest. Carol herself knew nothing of motherly tears and fatherly anxieties. She lived on peacefully in the room where she was born. But you never would have known that room, for Mr. Bird had a great deal of money, and though he felt sometimes as if he wanted to throw it all in the ocean, since it could not buy a strong body for his little girl, yet he was glad to make the place she lived in just as beautiful as it could be made. The room had been extended by the building of a large addition that hung out over the garden below, and was so filled with windows that it might have been a conservatory. The ones on the side were thus still nearer the little church of Our Savior than they used to be. Those in front looked out on the beautiful harbor, and those in the back commanded a view of nothing in particular but a little alley. Nevertheless, they were pleasantest of all to Carol, for the Ruggles family lived in the alley, and the 9 little middle-sized and big Ruggles children were the source of inexhaustible interest. The shutters could all be opened, and Carol could take a real sunbath in this lovely glass house, or they could all be closed when the dear head ached or the dear eyes were tired. The carpet was of soft gray, with clusters of green bay and holly leaves. The furniture was of white wood, on which an artist had painted snow scenes and Christmas trees and groups of merry children ringing bells and singing carols. Donald had made a pretty polished shelf and screwed it onto the outside of the footboard, and the boys always kept this full of blooming plants, which they changed from time to time. The headboard, too, had a bracket on either side where there were pots of maidenhair ferns. Lovebirds and canaries hung in their golden houses in the windows, and they, poor caged things, could hop as far from their wooden perches as Carol could venture from her little white bed. On one side of the room was a bookcase filled with hundreds, yes, I mean it, with hundreds and hundreds of books. Books with gay-colored pictures, books without, books with black and white outline sketches, books with none at all, books with verses, books with stories, books that made children laugh, and some that made them cry, books with words of 1 syllable for tiny boys and girls, and books with words of fearful length to puzzle wise ones. This was Carol's circulating library. Every Saturday, she chose 10 books, jotting their names down in a little diary. Into these, she slipped cards that said, "Please keep this book 2 weeks and read it. With love, Carol Bird." Then Mrs. Bird stepped into her carriage and took the 10 books to the children's hospital and brought home 10 others that she had left there the fortnight before. This was a source of great happiness, for some of the hospital children that were old enough to print or write and were strong enough to do it wrote Carol cunning little letters about the books, and she answered them, and they grew to be friends. It is very funny, but you do not always have to see people to love them. Just think about it and see if it isn't so. There was a high wainscoting of wood about the room, and on top of this, in a narrow gilt framework, ran a row of illuminated pictures, illustrating fairy tales, all in dull blue and gold and scarlet and silver and other lovely colors. From the door to the closet there was the story of the fair one with golden locks. From closet to bookcase ran Puss in Boots. From bookcase to fireplace was Jack the Giant Killer. And on the other side of the room were Hop-o'-my-Thumb, the Sleeping Beauty, and Cinderella. Then there was a great closet full of beautiful things to wear, but they were all dressing gowns and slippers and shawls. And there were drawers full of toys and games, but they were such as you could play with on your lap. There were no 9-pins, nor balls, nor bows and arrows, nor bean bags, nor tennis rackets. But after all, other children needed these more than Carol Bird, for she was always happy and contented, whatever she had or whatever she lacked. And after the room had been made so lovely for her, on her 8th Christmas, she always called herself in fun a bird of paradise. On these particular December days, she was happier than usual, for Uncle Jack was coming from Europe to spend the holidays. Dear, funny, jolly, loving, wise Uncle Jack, who came every 2 or 3 years and brought so much joy with him that the world looked as black as a thundercloud for a week after he went away. The mail had brought this letter. London, November 28th. Wish you Merry Christmas, you dearest birdlings in America. Preen your feathers and stretch the bird's nest a little, if you please, and let Uncle Jack in for the holidays. I am coming with such a trunk full of treasures that you'll have to borrow the stockings of Barnum's giant and giantess. I am coming to squeeze a certain little ladybird until she cries for mercy. I am coming to see if I can find a boy to take care of a little black pony I bought lately. It's the strangest thing I ever knew. I've hunted all over Europe and can't find a boy to suit me. I'll tell you why. I've set my heart on finding one with a dimple in his chin, because this pony particularly likes dimples. Hurrah! Cried Hugh. Bless my dear dimple! I'll never be ashamed of it again. Please drop a note to the clerk of the weather and have a good rousing snowstorm, say on the 22nd. None of your meek, gentle, nonsensical, shilly-shallying snowstorms. Not the sort where the flakes float lazily down from the sky as if they didn't care whether they ever got here or not, and then melt away as soon as they touch the earth, but a regular business-like whizzing, whirring, blurring, cutting snowstorm, warranted to freeze and stay on. I should like rather a large Christmas tree, if it's convenient, not one of those sprigs 5 or 6 feet high that you used to have 3 or 4 years ago when the birdlings were not fairly feathered out, but a tree of some size. Set it up in the garret if necessary, and then we can cut a hole in the roof if the tree chances to be too high for the room. Tell Bridget to begin to fatten a turkey. Tell her by the 20th of December that turkey must not be able to stand on its legs for fat, and then on the next 3 days she must allow it to recline easily on its side and stuff it to bursting. 1 ounce of stuffing beforehand is worth £1 afterwards. The pudding must be unusually huge and darkly, deeply, lugubriously black in color. It must be stuck so full of plums that the pudding itself will ooze out into the pan and not be brought onto the table at all. I expect to be there by the 20th to manage these little things, remembering it is the early bird that catches the worm, but give you the instructions in case I should be delayed. And Carol must decide on the size of the tree. She knows best. She was a Christmas child, and she must plead for the snowstorm. The clerk of the weather may pay some attention to her. And she must look up the boy with the dimple for me. She's likelier to find him than I am this minute. She must advise about the turkey, and Bridget must bring the pudding to her bedside and let her drop every separate plum into it and stir it once for luck, or I'll not eat a single slice. For Carol is the dearest part of Christmas to Uncle Jack, and he'll have none of it without her. She is better than all the turkeys and puddings and apples and spare ribs and wreaths and garlands and mistletoe and stockings and chimneys and sleigh bells in Christendom. She is the very sweetest Christmas carol that was ever written, said, sung, or chanted, and I am coming as fast as ships and railway trains can carry me to tell her so. Carol's joy knew no bounds. Mr. and Mrs. Bird laughed like children and kissed each other for sheer delight, and when the boys heard it, they simply whooped like wild Indians until the Ruggles family, whose backyard joined their garden, gathered at the door and wondered what was up in the big house. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Bird's Christmas Carol by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 4. Birds of a Feather Flock Together. Uncle Jack did really come on the 20th. He was not detained by business, nor did he get left behind nor snowed up, as frequently happens in stories, and in real life, too, I am afraid. The snowstorm came also, and the turkey nearly died a natural and premature death from overeating. Donald came, too. Donald with a line of down upon his upper lip, and Greek and Latin on his tongue, and stores of knowledge in his handsome head, and stories, bless me, you couldn't turn over a chip without reminding Donald of something that happened at college. One or the other was always at Carol's bedside, for they fancied her paler than she used to be, and they could not bear her out of sight. It was Uncle Jack, though, who sat beside her in the winter twilights. The room was quiet and almost dark, save for the snow light outside and the flickering flame of the fire that danced over the sleeping beauty's face and touched the fair one's golden locks with ruddier glory. Carol's hand, all too thin and white these latter days, lay close clasped in Uncle Jack's, and they talked together quietly of many, many things. "I want to tell you all about my plans for Christmas this year, Uncle Jack," said Carol on the first evening of his visit, "because it will be the loveliest one I ever had." The boys laugh at me for caring so much about it, but it isn't altogether because it is Christmas, nor because it is my birthday. But long, long ago, when I first began to be ill, I used to think the first thing when I waked on Christmas morning, today is Christ's birthday and mine. I did not put the words close together because that made it seem too bold, but I first thought Christ's birthday, and then in a minute, softly to myself, and mine. Christ's birthday and mine. And so I do not quite feel about Christmas as other girls do. Mama says she supposes that ever so many other children have been born on that day. I often wonder where they are, Uncle Jack, and whether it is a dear thought to them too, or whether I am so much in bed and so often alone that it means more to me. Oh, I do hope that none of them are poor or cold or hungry, and I wish they were all as happy as I, because they are my little brothers and sisters. Now, Uncle Jack, dear, I am going to try and make somebody happy every single Christmas that I live, and this year it is to be the Ruggleses in the rear. That large and interesting brood of children in the little house at the end of the back garden? Yes. Isn't it nice to see so many together? We ought to call them the Ruggles children, of course, but Donald began talking of them as the Ruggleses in the rear. And Papa and Mama took it up, and now we cannot seem to help it. The house was built for Mr. Carter's coachman, but Mr. Carter lives in Europe, and the gentleman who rents his place doesn't care what happens to it, and so this poor Irish family came to live there. When they first moved in, I used to sit in my window and watch them play in their backyard. They are so strong and jolly and good-natured. And then one day I had a terrible headache, and Donald asked them if they would please not scream quite so loud, and they explained that they were having a game of circus, but that they would change and play deaf and dumb school all the afternoon. Laughed Uncle Jack. What an obliging family, to be sure. Yes, we all thought it was very funny, and I smiled at them from the window when I was well enough to be up again. Now Sarah Maud comes to her door when the children come home from school, and if Mama nods her head, yes, that means Carol is very well, and then you ought to hear the little Ruggleses yell. I believe they try to see how much noise they can make, but if Mama shakes her head no, they always play at quiet games. Then one day Carrie, my pet canary, flew out of her cage, and Peter Ruggles caught her and brought her back, and I had him up here in my room to thank him. Is Peter the oldest? No, Sarah Maud is the oldest. She helps do the washing, and Peter is the next. He is a dressmaker's boy. And which is the pretty little red-haired girl? That's Kitty. And the fat youngster? Baby Larry. And the freckled one. Now, don't laugh. That's Peoria. Carol, you are joking. No, really, Uncle dear. She was born in Peoria, that's all. And is the next boy Oshkosh? No, laughed Carol. The others are Susan and Clement and Ailey and Cornelius. How did you ever learn all their names? Well, I have what I call a window school. It is too cold now, but in warm weather I am wheeled out on my little balcony, and the Ruggleses climb up and walk along our garden fence and sit down on the roof of our carriage house. That brings them quite near, and I read to them and tell them stories. On Thanksgiving Day they came up for a few minutes. It was quite warm at 11 o'clock, and we told each other what we had to be thankful for. But they gave such queer answers that Papa had to run away for fear of laughing, and I couldn't understand them very well. Susan was thankful for trunks, of all things in the world, Cornelius for horse cars, Kitty for pork steak, while Clem, who is very quiet, brightened up when I came to him and said he was thankful for his lame puppy. Wasn't that pretty? It might teach some of us a lesson, mightn't it, little girl? That's what Mama said. Now I'm going to give this whole Christmas to the Ruggleses, and Uncle Jack, I earned part of the money myself. You, my bird, how? Well, you see, it could not be my own Christmas if Papa gave me all the money, and I thought to really keep Christ's birthday, I ought to do something of my very own. And so I talked with Mama. Of course, she thought of something lovely. She always does. Mama's head is just brimming over with lovely thoughts, and all I have to do is ask, and out pops the very one I want. This thought was to let her write down, just as I told her, a description of how a little girl lived in her own room 3 years, and what she did to amuse herself. And we sent it to a magazine and got $25 for it. Just think! Well, well, cried Uncle Jack, my little girl a real author. And what are you going to do with this wonderful own money of yours? I shall give the 9 Ruggleses a grand Christmas dinner here in this very room. That will be Papa's contribution. And afterwards, a beautiful Christmas tree, fairly blooming with presents. That will be my part. For I have another way of adding to my $25 so that I can buy everything I like. I should like it very much if you would sit at the head of the table, Uncle Jack, for nobody could ever be frightened of you, you dearest, dearest, dearest thing that ever was. Mama is going to help us, but Papa and the boys are going to eat together downstairs for fear of making the little Ruggleses shy. And after we've had a merry time with the tree, we can open my window and all listen together to the music at the evening church service, if it comes before the children go. I have written a letter to the organist and asked him if I might have the 2 songs I like best. Will you see if it is all right? Bird's Nest, December 21st. Dear Mr. Wilkie, I am the little girl who lives next door to the church, and as I seldom go out, the music on practice days and Sundays is one of my greatest pleasures. I want to know if you can let the boys sing Carol Brothers Carol on Christmas night, and if the one who sings My Ain Country so beautifully may please sing that too. I think it is the loveliest song in the world, but it always makes me cry, doesn't it you? If it isn't too much trouble, I hope they can sing them both quite early, as after 10 o'clock I may be asleep. Yours respectfully, Carol Bird. P.S. The reason I like Carol Brothers Carol is because the choir boys sang it 11 years ago, the morning I was born, and put it into Mama's head to call me Carol. She didn't remember then that my other name would be Bird, because she was half asleep and couldn't think of but one thing at a time. Donald says if I had been born on the 4th of July, they would have named me Independence, or if on the 22nd of February, Georgina, or even Cherry, like Cherry and Martin Chuzzlewit, but I like my own name and birthday best. Yours truly, Carol Bird. Uncle Jack thought the letter quite right, and did not even smile at her telling the organist so many family items. The days flew by, as they always fly in holiday time, and it was Christmas Eve before anybody knew it. The family festival was quiet and very pleasant, but quite swallowed up in the grander preparations for next day. Carol and Elfrida, her pretty German nurse, had ransacked books and introduced so many plans and plays and customs and merrymakings from Germany and Holland and England and a dozen other places that you would scarcely have known how or where you were keeping Christmas. The dog and the cat had enjoyed their celebration under Carol's direction. Each had a tiny table with a lighted candle in the center and a bit of bologna sausage placed very near it, and everybody laughed till the tears stood in their eyes to see Villikins and Dinah struggle to nibble the sausages, and at the same time evade the candle flame. Villikins barked and sniffed and howled in impatience, and after many vain attempts succeeded in dragging off the prize, though he singed his nose in doing it. Dinah, meanwhile, watched him placidly, her delicate nostrils quivering with expectation, and after all excitement had subsided, walked with dignity to the table, her beautiful gray satin tail sweeping behind her, and calmly putting up one velvet paw, drew the sausage gently down, and walked out of the room without turning a hair, so to speak. Elfrida had scattered handfuls of seeds over the snow in the garden, that the wild birds might have a comfortable breakfast next morning, and had stuffed bundles of dried grasses in the fireplaces, so that the reindeer of Santa Claus could refresh themselves after their long gallops across country. This was really only done for fun, but it pleased Carol. And when after dinner the whole family had gone to church to see the Christmas decorations, Carol limped wearily out on her little crutches, and with Elfrida's help, placed all the family boots in a row in the upper hall. That was to keep the dear ones from quarreling all through the year. There were Papa's stout top boots, Mama's pretty buttoned shoes next, then Uncle Jack's, Donald's, Paul's, and Hugh's, and at the end of the line her own little white worsted slippers. Last and sweetest of all, like the little children in Austria, she put a lighted candle in her window to guide the dear Christ-child, lest he should stumble in the dark night as he passed up the deserted street. This done, she dropped into bed, a rather tired but very happy Christmas fairy. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Bird's Christmas Carol by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 5. Some Other Birds Are Taught to Fly. Before the earliest Ruggles could wake and toot his 5-cent tin horn, Mrs. Ruggles was up and stirring about the house, for it was a gala day in the family. Gala day! I should think so! Were not her 9 children invited to a dinner party at the great house, and weren't they going to sit down free and equal with the mightiest in the land? She had been preparing for this grand occasion ever since the receipt of the invitation, which, by the way, had been speedily enshrined in an old photograph frame and hung under the looking-glass in the most prominent place in the kitchen, where it stared the occasional visitor directly in the eye and made him pale with envy. Bird's Nest, December 17th. Dear Mrs. Ruggles, I am going to have a dinner party on Christmas Day and would like to have all your children come. I want them, every one, please, from Sarah Maud to baby Larry. Mama says dinner will be at 5:30 and the Christmas tree at 7, so you may expect them home at 9 o'clock. Wishing you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I am yours truly, Carol Bird. Breakfast was on the table promptly at 7 o'clock, and there was a very little of it, too, for it was an excellent day for short rations, though Mrs. Ruggles heaved a sigh as she reflected that even the boys, with their India-rubber stomachs, would be just as hungry the day after the dinner party as if they had never had any at all. As soon as the scanty meal was over, she announced the plan of the campaign. Now, Susan, you and Kitty wash up the dishes, and Peter, can't you spread up the bed so I can get to cutting out Larry's new suit? I ain't satisfied with his clothes, and I thought in the night of a way to make him a dress out of my old plaid shawl, kind of Scotch style, you know. You other boys clear out from underfoot. Clem, you and Con hop into bed with Larry while I wash your underflannins. 'Twon't take long to dry 'em. Sarah Maud, I think 'twould be perfectly handsome if you ripped them brass buttons off your Uncle Policeman's coat and sewed 'em in a row up the front of your green skirt. Susan, you must iron out yours and Kitty's aprons. And there I came mighty near forgetting Peoria's stockings. I counted the whole lot last night when I was washing of 'em, and there ain't but 19 anyhow you fix 'em, and no 9 pairs mates nohow, and I ain't going to have my children wear odd stockings to a dinner company, brought up as I was. Alec, can't you run out and ask Miss Cullen to lend me a pair of stockings for Peory? And tell her, if she will, Peory'll give Jim half her candy when she comes home. Won't you, Peory? Peoria was young and greedy and thought the remedy so much worse than the disease that she set up a deafening howl at the projected bargain, a howl so rebellious and so out of all season that her mother started in her direction with flashing eye and uplifted hand. But she let it fall suddenly, saying, "No, I won't lick ya Christmas Day if you drive me crazy. But speak up smart now and say whether you'd rather give Tim Cullen half your candy or go bare-legged tear the party." The matter being put so plainly, Peoria collected her faculties, dried her tears, and chose the lesser evil, Clem having hastened the decision by an affectionate wink that meant he'd go halves with her on his candy. "That's a lady," cried her mother. "Now, you young ones, that ain't doing nothing. Play all you want to before noontime, for after you get through eating at 12 o'clock, me and Sarah Maud's going to give you such a washing and combing and dressing as you never had before and never will again. And then I'm going to set you down and give you 2 solid hours training in manners, and 'twon't be no fooling neither." "All we've got to do is to go eat," grumbled Peter. "Well, that's enough," responded his mother. "There's more'n one way of eating, let me tell you, and you've got a heap to learn about, Peter Ruggles. Lord sakes, I wish you children could see the way I was fetched up to eat. Never took a meal of victuals in the kitchen before I married Ruggles. But you can't keep up that style with 9 young ones and your pa always off to sea." The big Ruggleses worked so well, and the little Ruggleses kept from underfoot so successfully that by 1 o'clock 9 complete toilets were laid out in solemn grandeur on the beds. I say complete, but I do not know whether they would be called so in the best society. The law of compensation had been well applied. He that had necktie had no cuffs. She that had sash had no handkerchief, and vice versa. But they all had boots and a certain amount of clothing, such as it was, the outside layer being in every case quite above criticism. "Now, Sarah Maud," said Mrs. Ruggles, her face shining with excitement, "everything is redd up and we can begin. I've got a bowler and a kettle and a pot of hot water. Peter, you go into the back room, and I'll take Susan, Kitty, Peory, and Cornelius, and Sarah Maud, you take Clem and Allie and Larry 1 to a time, and get as fur as you can with 'em. And then I'll finish him off while you do yourself." Sarah Maud couldn't have scrubbed with any more decision and force if she had been doing floors, and the little Ruggleses bore it bravely, not from natural heroism, but for the joy that was set before them. Not being satisfied, however, with the tone of their complexions, she wound up operations by applying a little Bristol brick from the knife-board, which served as the proverbial last straw from under which the little Ruggleses issued rather red and raw and out of temper. When the clock struck 3, they were all clothed, and most of them in their right minds, ready for those last touches that always take the most time. Kitty's red hair was curled in 34 ringlets. Sarah Maud's was braided in 1 pigtail, and Susan's and Allie's in 2 braids apiece, while Peoria's resisted all advances in the shape of hair oils and stuck out straight on all sides, like that of the Circassian girl of the circus. So Clem said, and he was sent into the bedroom for it too, from whence he was dragged out forgivingly by Peoria herself 5 minutes later. Then, exciting moment, came linen collars for some, and neckties and bows for others. And eureka! The Ruggleses were dressed, and Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. A row of seats was formed directly through the middle of the kitchen. There were not quite chairs enough for 10, since the family had rarely all wanted to sit down at once, somebody always being out or in bed, but the wood box and the coal hod finished out the line nicely. The children took their places according to age, Sarah Maud at the head and Larry on the coal hod, and Mrs. Ruggles seated herself in front, surveying them proudly as she wiped the sweat of honest toil from her brow. "Well," she exclaimed, "if I do say so as shouldn't, I never see a cleaner, more stylish mess of children in my life. I do wish Ruggles could look at ye for a minute. Now, I've oven told ye what kind of family the McGills was. I've got some reason to be proud. Your uncle is on the police force of New York City. You can take up the newspaper most any day and see his name printed right out, James McGrill, and I can't have my children fetched up common like some folks. When they go out, they've got to have clothes and learn to act decent." Now, I want to see how you're going to behave when you get there tonight. Let's start in at the beginning and act out the whole business. Pile into the bedroom there, every last one of ye, and show me how you're going to go into the parlor. This'll be the parlor, and I'll be Miss Bird." The youngsters hustled into the next room in high glee, and Mrs. Ruggles drew herself up in her chair with an infinitely haughty and purse-proud expression that much better suited a descendant of the McGrills than modest Mrs. Bird. The bedroom was small, and there presently ensued such a clatter that she would have thought a herd of wild cattle had broken loose. The door opened, and they straggled in, all the little ones giggling, with Sarah Maud at the head, looking as if she had been caught in the act of stealing sheep, while Larry, being last in line, seemed to think the door a sort of gate of heaven, which would be shut in his face if he didn't get there in time. Accordingly, he struggled ahead of his elders and disgraced himself by tumbling in head foremost. Mrs. Ruggles looked severe. "There, I knew you'd do it in some set fool way. Try it again, and if Larry can't come in on 2 legs, he can stay to home." The matter began to assume a graver aspect. The little Ruggleses stopped giggling and backed into the bedroom, issuing presently with lockstep, Indian file, a scared and hunted expression in every countenance. "No, no, no!" cried Mrs. Ruggles in despair. "You look for all the world like a gang of prisoners. There ain't no style to that. Spread out more, can't you, and act kind of careless, like nobody's going to kill ya." The third time brought deserved success, and the pupils took their seats in a row. "Now you know," said Mrs. Ruggles, "there ain't enough decent hats to go around, and if there was, I don't know's I'd let you wear 'em, for the boys would never think to take them off when they got inside, but anyhow, there ain't enough good ones. Now, look at me in the eye. You needn't wear no hats, none of yer. And when you get into the parlor and they ask you to lay off your hats, Sarah Maud must speak up and say it was such a pleasant evening and such a short walk that you left your hats to home to save trouble. Now, can you remember?" All the little Ruggleses shouted, "Yes, Mom," in chorus. "What have you got to do with it?" demanded their mother. "Did I tell you to say it? Wasn't I talking to Sarah Maud?" The little Ruggleses hung their diminished heads. "Yes, Mom," they piped more feebly. "Now get up, all of ye, and try it. Speak up, Sarah Maud." Sarah Maud's tongue clove to the roof of her mouth. "Quick! I thought it was such a pleasant hat that we'd better leave our short walk to home," recited Sarah Maud in an agony of mental effort. This was too much for the boys. "Oh, whatever shall I do with ye?" moaned the unhappy mother. "I suppose I've got to learn it to you." Which she did, word for word, until Sarah Maud thought she could stand on her head and say it backwards. "Now, Cornelius, what are you going to say to make yourself good company?" "Dunno," said Cornelius, turning pale. "Well, ye ain't going to set there like a bump on a log, 'thout saying a word to pay for your victuals, are ye? Ask Miss Bird how she's feeling this evening, or if Mr. Bird's having a busy season, or something like that. Now, we'll make believe we've got to the dinner. That won't be so hard, 'cause you'll have something to do. It's awful bothersome to stand around and act stylish. If they have napkins, Sarah Maud down to Peory may put 'em in their laps, and the rest of ye can tuck 'em in your necks. Don't eat with your fingers. Don't grab no victuals off n'other's plates. Don't reach out for nothing, but wait till you're asked. And if you never get asked, don't get up and grab it. Don't spill nothing on the tablecloth, or like's not Miss Bird'll send you away from the table. Now, we'll try a few things to see how they'll go. Mr. Clement, do you eat cranberry sauce?" "Bet your life!" cried Clem, who, not having taken in the idea exactly, had mistaken this for an ordinary family question. Clement Ruggles, do you mean to tell me that you'd say that to a dinner party? I'll give you one more chance, Mr. Clement. Will you take some of the cranberry? Yes, Mom, thank ye kindly, if you happen to have any handy. Very good indeed. Mr. Peter, do you speak for white or dark meat? I ain't particular as to color. Anything that nobody else wants will suit me, answered Peter with his best air. First rate! Nobody could speak more genteel than that. Miss Kitty, will you have hard or soft sarse with your pudding? A little of both, if you please, and I'm much obliged, said Kitty with decided ease and grace, at which all the other Ruggleses pointed the finger of shame at her, and Peter grunted expressively that their meaning might not be mistaken. You just stop your grunting, Peter Ruggles. That was all right. I wish I could get it into your heads that it ain't so much what you say as the way you say it. Allie, you and Larry's too little to train, so you just look at the rest and do as they's do, and the Lord have mercy on you and help you to act decent. Now, is there anything more ye'd like to practice? If you tell me one more thing, I can't set up and eat, said Peter gloomily. I'm so crammed full of manners now I'm ready to burst. That no dinner at all. Me too, chimed in Cornelius. Well, I'm sorry for you both, rejoined Mrs. Ruggles sarcastically. If the amount of manners you've got on hand now troubles ye, you're dreadful easy hurt. Now, Sarah Maud, after dinner, about once in so often, you must say, I guess we'd better be going. And if they say, oh, no, set a while longer, you can stay. But if they don't say nothing, you've got to get up and go. Can you remember? About once in so often. Could any words in the language be fraught with more terrible and wearing uncertainty? Well, answered Sarah Maud mournfully, seems as if this whole dinner party set right square on top of me. Maybe I could manage my own manners, but to manage 9 mannerses is worse'n staying to home. Oh, don't fret, said her mother, good-naturedly. I guess you'll get along. I wouldn't mind if folks would only say, oh, children will be children. But they won't. They'll say, land of goodness, who fetched them children up? Now it's 5:15. You can go, and whatever you do, don't forget your mother was a McGrill. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Birds' Christmas Carol by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 6. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. The children went out the back door quietly and were presently lost to sight, Sarah Maud slipping and stumbling along absent-mindedly as she recited under her breath, It was such a pleasant evening and such a short walk, we thought we'd leave our hats to home. Peter rang the doorbell, and presently a servant admitted them, and whispering something in Sarah's ear, drew her downstairs into the kitchen. The other Ruggleses stood in horror-stricken groups as the door closed behind their commanding officer, but there was no time for reflection, for a voice from above was heard, saying, Come right upstairs, please. There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's not but to do or die. Accordingly, they walked upstairs, and Elfrida, the nurse, ushered them into a room more splendid than anything they had ever seen. But, oh, woe! Where was Sarah Maud? And was it fate that Mrs. Bird should say, at once, Did you lay your hats in the hall? Peter felt himself elected, by circumstance, the head of the family, and casting one imploring look at tongue-tied Susan standing next to him, said huskily, It was so very pleasant that we hadn't good hats enough to go around," put in little Susan bravely to help him out, and then froze with horror that the ill-fated words had slipped off her tongue. However, Mrs. Bird said pleasantly, "Of course you wouldn't wear hats such a short distance. I forgot when I asked. Now, will you come right in to Miss Carol's room? She is so anxious to see you." Just then Sarah Maud came up the back stairs, so radiant with joy from her secret interview with the cook that Peter could have pinched her with a clear conscience, and Carol gave them a joyful welcome. "But where is baby Larry?" she cried, looking over the group with searching eye. "Didn't he come?" "Larry? Larry! Good gracious, where was Larry?" They were all sure that he had come in with them, for Susan remembered scolding him for tripping over the doormat. Uncle Jack went into convulsions of laughter. "Are you sure there were 9 of you?" he asked merrily. "I think so, sir," said Peoria timidly, "but anyhow, there was Larry." And she showed signs of weeping. "Oh, well, cheer up," cried Uncle Jack. "I guess he's not lost, only mislaid. I'll go and find him before you can say Jack Robinson." "I'll go too, if you please, sir," said Sarah Maud, "for it was my place to mind him, and if he's lost I can relish my victuals." The other Ruggleses stood rooted to the floor. Was this a dinner party, forsooth? And if so, why were such things ever spoken of as festive occasions? Sarah Maud went out through the hall, calling, "Larry! Larry!" And without any interval of suspense, a thin voice piped up from below, "Here I be." The truth was that Larry, being deserted by his natural guardian, dropped behind the rest and wriggled into the hat tree to wait for her, having no notion of walking unprotected into the jaws of a dinner party. Finding that she did not come, he tried to crawl from his refuge and call somebody, when, dark and dreadful ending to a tragic day, he found that he was too much intertwined with umbrellas and canes to move a single step. He was afraid to yell. When I have said this of Larry Ruggles, I have pictured a state of helpless terror that ought to wring tears from every eye, and the sound of Sarah Maud's beloved voice some seconds later was like a strain of angel music in his ears. Uncle Jack dried his tears, carried him upstairs, and soon had him in breathless fits of laughter, while Carol so made the other Ruggleses forget themselves that they were soon talking like accomplished diners out. Carol's bed had been moved into the farthest corner of the room, and she was lying on the outside, dressed in a wonderful soft white wrapper. Her golden hair fell in soft, fluffy curls over her white forehead and neck. Her cheeks flushed delicately, her eyes beamed with joy, and the children told their mother afterwards that she looked as beautiful as the pictures of the Blessed Virgin. There was great bustle behind a huge screen in another part of the room, and at 5:30 this was taken away, and the Christmas dinner table stood revealed. What a wonderful sight it was to the poor little Ruggles children, who ate their sometimes scanty meals on the kitchen table. It blazed with tall colored candles. It gleamed with glass and silver. It blushed with flowers. It groaned with good things to eat. So it was not strange that the Ruggleses, forgetting that their mother was a McGrill, shrieked in admiration of the fairy spectacle. But Larry's behavior was the most disgraceful, for he stood not upon the order of his going, but went at once for a high chair that pointed unmistakably to him, climbed up like a squirrel, gave a comprehensive look at the turkey, clapped his hands in ecstasy, rested his fat arms on the table, and cried with joy, "I beat the whole lot of ye!" Carol laughed until she cried, giving orders. Meanwhile, Uncle Jack, "Please sit at the head, Sarah Maud at the foot, and that will leave 4 on each side. Mama is going to help Elfrida, so that the children need not look after each other, but just have a good time." A sprig of holly lay by each plate, and nothing would do but each little Ruggles must leave his seat and have it pinned on by Carol, and as each course was served, one of them pleaded to take something to her. There was hurrying to and fro, I can assure you, for it is quite a difficult matter to serve a Christmas dinner on the 3rd floor of a great city house. But if every dish had had to be carried up a rope ladder, the servants would gladly have done so. There was turkey and chicken, with delicious gravy and stuffing, and there were half a dozen vegetables with cranberry jelly and celery and pickles. And as for the way these delicacies were served, the Ruggleses never forgot it as long as they lived. Peter nudged Kitty, who sat next him, and said, "Look, will yer? Every fellow's got his own particular butter. I suppose that's to show yer can eat that much no more." "No, it ain't neither, for that pig of a Peory's just getting another helping." "Yes," whispered Kitty, "and the napkins is marked with big red letters. I wonder if that's so nobody'll nip 'em. And oh, Peter, look at the pictures painted right onto the dishes. Did you ever?" "The plums is all took out of my cranberry sarse, and it's frizzed to a stiff gel," shouted Peoria in wild excitement. "Hi-ya, I got a wishbone," sung Larry, regardless of Sarah Maud's frown, after which she asked to have his seat changed, giving as excuse that he generally sat beside her and would feel strange. The true reason being that she desired to kick him gently under the table whenever he passed what might be termed the McGrill line. "I declare to goodness," murmured Susan on the other side, "there's so much to look at I can scarcely eat nothing." "Bet your life I can," said Peter, who had kept one servant busily employed ever since he sat down, for luckily no one was asked by Uncle Jack whether he would have a second helping, but the dishes were quietly passed under their noses, and not a single Ruggles refused anything that was offered him, even unto the 7th time. Then, when Carol and Uncle Jack perceived that more turkey was a physical impossibility, the meats were taken off and the dessert was brought in, a dessert that would have frightened a strong man after such a dinner as had preceded it. Not so the Ruggleses, for a strong man is nothing to a small boy, and they kindled to the dessert as if the turkey had been a dream and the 6 vegetables an optical delusion. There was plum pudding, mince pie, and ice cream, and there were nuts and raisins and oranges. Kitty chose ice cream, explaining that she knew it by sight, but hadn't never tasted none, but all the rest took the entire variety, without any regard to consequences. "My dear child," whispered Uncle Jack, as he took Carol an orange, "there is no doubt about the necessity of this feast, but I do advise you after this to have them twice a year, or quarterly perhaps, for the way they eat is positively dangerous. I assure you I tremble for that terrible Peoria. I'm going to run races with her after dinner." "Never mind," laughed Carol. "Let them eat for once. It does my heart good to see them, and they shall come oftener next year." The feast being over, the Ruggleses lay back in their chairs languidly, and the table was cleared in a trice. Then a door was opened into the next room, and there, in a corner facing Carol's bed, which had been wheeled as close as possible, stood the brilliantly lighted Christmas tree, glittering with gilded walnuts and tiny silver balloons, and wreathed with snowy chains of popcorn. The presents had been bought mostly with Carol's story money, and were selected after long consultations with Mrs. Bird. Each girl had a blue knitted hood, and each boy a red crocheted comforter. All made by Mama, Carol, and Elfrida, because if you buy everything, it doesn't show so much love, said Carol. Then every girl had a pretty plaid dress of a different color, and every boy a warm coat of the right size. Here the useful presents stopped, and they were quite enough, but Carol had pleaded to give them something for fun. "I know they need the clothes," she had said when they were talking over the matter just after Thanksgiving, "but they don't care much for them after all. Now, Papa, won't you please let me go without part of my presents this year and give me the money they would cost to buy something to amuse them?" "You can have both," said Mr. Bird promptly. "Is there any need of my little girl's going without her Christmas? I should like to know. Spend all the money you like." "But that isn't the thing," objected Carol, nestling close to her father. "It wouldn't be mine. What is the use? Haven't I almost everything already? And am I not the happiest girl in the world this year with Uncle Jack and Donald at home? Now, Papa, you know very well it is more blessed to give than to receive. Then why won't you let me do it? You never look half as happy when you are getting your presents as when you are giving us ours. Now, Papa, submit, or I shall have to be very firm and disagreeable with you." "Very well, Your Highness, I surrender." "That's a dear Papa. Now, what were you going to give me? Confess." "A bronze figure of Santa Claus, and in the little round belly that shakes when he laughs like a bowl full of jelly is a wonderful clock. Oh, you would never give it up if you could see it." "Nonsense," laughed Carol. "As I never have to get up to breakfast, nor go to bed, nor catch trains, I think my old clock will do very well. Now, Mamma, what were you going to give me?" "Oh, I hadn't decided. A few more books, and a gold thimble, and a smelling bottle, and a music box." "Poor Carol," laughed the child merrily. "She can afford to give up these lovely things, for there will still be left Uncle Jack and Donald and Paul and Hugh and Uncle Rob and Aunt Elsie and a dozen other people." So Carol had her way, as she generally did, but it was usually a good way, which was fortunate under the circumstances. And Sarah Maud had a set of Miss Alcott's books, and Peter a modest silver watch, Cornelius a tool chest, Clement a doghouse for his lame puppy, Larry a magnificent Noah's Ark, and each of the little girls a beautiful doll. You can well believe that everybody was very merry and very thankful. All the family, from Mr. Bird down to the cook, said they had never seen so much happiness in the space of 3 hours, but it had to end, as all things do. The candles flickered and went out, the tree was left alone with its gilded ornaments, and Mrs. Bird sent the children downstairs at 8:30, thinking that Carol looked tired. "Now, my darling, you have done quite enough for one day," said Mrs. Bird, getting Carol into her little night-dress. "I am afraid you will feel worse tomorrow, and that would be a sad ending to such a good time." "Oh, wasn't it a lovely, lovely time?" sighed Carol. "From first to last, everything was just right. I shall never forget Larry's face when he looked at the turkey, nor Pete's when he saw his watch, nor that sweet, sweet Kitty's smile when she kissed her dolly, nor the tears in poor dull Sarah Maud's eyes when she thanked me for her books, nor—" "But we mustn't talk any longer about it tonight," said Mrs. Bird anxiously. "You are too tired, dear." "I am not so very tired, Mamma. I have felt well all day, not a bit of pain anywhere. Perhaps this has done me good." "Perhaps. I hope so." There was no noise or confusion. It was just a merry time. "Now, may I close the door and leave you alone? I will steal in softly the first thing in the morning and see if you are all right, but I think you need to be quiet." "Oh, I'm willing to stay alone, but I am not sleepy yet, and I am going to hear the music by and by, you know. Yes, I have opened the window a little and put the screen in front of it so that you will not feel the air." "Can I have the shutters open? And won't you turn my bed a little, please? This morning I woke ever so early, and one bright, beautiful star shone in that eastern window. I never saw it before, and I thought of the star in the east that guided the wise men to the place where Jesus was. Good night, Mamma. Such a happy, happy day." "Good night, my precious little Christmas Carol. Mother's blessed Christmas child. "Bend your head a minute, Mother dear," whispered Carol, calling her mother back. "Mamma, dear, I do think that we have kept Christ's birthday this time, just as he would like it. Don't you?" "I am sure of it," said Mrs. Bird softly. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Bird's Christmas Carol by Kate Douglas Wiggin. Chapter 7. The Birdling Flies Away. The Ruggleses had finished a last romp in the library with Paul and Hugh, and Uncle Jack had taken them home and stayed a while to chat with Mrs. Ruggles, who opened the door for them, her face all aglow with excitement and delight. When Kitty and Clem showed her the oranges and nuts they had kept for her, she astonished them by saying that at 6 o'clock Mrs. Bird had sent her in the finest dinner she had ever seen in her life, and not only that, but a piece of dress goods that must have cost $1 a yard if it cost a cent. As Uncle Jack went down the little porch, he looked back into the window for a last glimpse of the family as the children gathered about their mother, showing their beautiful presents again and again, and then upward to a window in the great house yonder. "A little child shall lead them," he thought. "Well, if anything ever happens to Carol, I will take the Ruggleses under my wing." "Softly, Uncle Jack," whispered the boys as he walked into the library a little while later. "We are listening to the music in the church. They sang 'Carol, Brothers, Carol' a while ago, and now we think the organist is beginning to play 'My Ain Country' for Carol." "I hope she hears it," said Mrs. Bird, "but they are very late tonight, and I dare not speak to her lest she should be asleep. It is after 10 o'clock." The boy soprano, clad in white surplice, stood in the organ loft. The lamps shone full upon his crown of fair hair, and his pale face, with its serious blue eyes, looked paler than usual. Perhaps it was something in the tender thrill of the voice, or in the sweet words, but there were tears in many eyes, both in the church and in the great house next door. "I'm far frae my hame, I'm weary often whiles, for the languid for hame bringing, and my father's welcome smiles. I'll ne'er be full content until my een do see the gowden gates of heaven in my ain country. The earth is decked with flowers, money-tinted, fresh and gay, and the birdies warble blithe, for my father made them say. But these sights and these sounds will as naething be to me when I hear the angels singing in my ain country. Like a bairn to its mither, a wee birdie to its nest, I fain would be ganging noo unto me father's breast, for he gathers in his arms helpless, worthless lambs like me, and carries them himself to his ain country." There were tears in many eyes, but not in Carol's. The loving heart had quietly ceased to beat, and the wee birdie in the great house had flown to its home nest. Carol had fallen asleep, but as to the song, I think perhaps I cannot say she heard it after all. So sad an ending to a happy day, perhaps to those who were left, and yet Carol's mother, even in the freshness of her grief, was glad that her darling had slipped away on the loveliest day of her life, out of its glad content into everlasting peace. She was glad that she had gone, as she had come, on wings of song, when all the world was brimming over with joy, glad of every grateful smile, of every joyous burst of laughter, of every loving thought and word and deed the dear last day had brought. Sadness reigned, it is true, in the little house behind the garden, and one day poor Sarah Maud, with a courage born of despair, threw on her hood and shawl, walked straight to a certain house a mile away, dashed up the marble steps and into good Dr. Bartle's office, falling at his feet as she cried, "Oh, sir, it was me and our children that went to Miss Carol's last dinner party, and if we had made her worse, we could never be happy again." Then the kind old gentleman took her rough hand in his and told her to dry her tears, for neither she nor any of her flock had hastened Carol's flight. Indeed, he said that had it not been for the strong hopes and wishes that filled her tired heart, she could not have stayed long enough to keep that last Merry Christmas with her dear ones. And so the old years, fraught with memories, die, one after another, and the new years, bright with hopes, are born to take their places. But Carol lives again in every chime of Christmas bells that peal glad tidings, and in every Christmas anthem sung by childish voices. The end of Chapter 7 and of The Bird's Christmas Carol. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.
The Story of Prince Ahmed and the Fairy Parabanu II, from the Blue Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. When Prince Ahmed came pretty nigh to these rocks, he perceived an arrow, which he gathered up, looked earnestly at it, and was in the greatest astonishment to find it was the same he shot away. "Certainly," said he to himself, "neither I nor any man living could shoot an arrow so far," and, finding it laid flat, not sticking into the ground, he judged that it had rebounded against the rock. "There must be some mystery in this," said he to himself again, "and it may be advantageous to me. Perhaps fortune, to make me amends for depriving me of what I had thought the greatest happiness, may have reserved a greater blessing for my comfort." As these rocks were full of caves, and some of those caves were deep, the prince entered into one, and, looking about, cast his eyes on an iron door which seemed to have no lock, but he feared it was fastened. However, thrusting against it, it opened, and discovered an easy descent, but no steps, which he walked down with his arrow in his hand. At first he thought he was going into a dark, obscure place, but presently a quite different light succeeded that which he came out of, and, entering into a large, spacious place at about 50 or 60 paces distant, he perceived a magnificent palace, which he had not then time enough to look at. At the same time, a lady of majestic port and air advanced as far as the porch, attended by a large troop of ladies, so finely dressed and beautiful that it was difficult to distinguish which was the mistress. As soon as Prince Ahmed perceived the lady, he made all imaginable haste to go and pay his respects, and the lady, on her part, seeing him coming, prevented him from addressing his discourse to her first, but said to him, "Come near, Prince Ahmed, you are welcome." It was no small surprise to the prince to hear himself named in a place he had never heard of, though so nigh to his father's capital, and he could not comprehend how he should be known to a lady who was a stranger to him. At last he returned the lady's compliment by throwing himself at her feet, and rising up again, said to her, "Madam, I return you 1,000 thanks for the assurance you give me of a welcome to a place where I believed my imprudent curiosity had made me penetrate too far. But, madam, may I, without being guilty of ill manners, dare to ask you by what adventure you know me, and how you, who live in the same neighborhood with me, should be so great a stranger to me?" "Prince," said the lady, "let us go into the hall. There I will gratify you in your request." After these words, the lady led Prince Ahmed into the hall. Then she sat down on a sofa, and, when the prince, by her entreaty, had done the same, she said, "You are surprised, you say, that I should know you and not be known by you, but you will no longer be surprised when I inform you who I am. You are undoubtedly sensible that your religion teaches you to believe that the world is inhabited by genies as well as men. I am the daughter of one of the most powerful and distinguished genies, and my name is Parabanu. The only thing that I have to add is, that you seemed to me worthy of a more happy fate than that of possessing the Princess Nuranahar, and that you might attain to it. I was present when you drew your arrow, and foresaw it would not go beyond Prince Hussein's. I took it in the air, and gave it the necessary motion to strike against the rocks near which you found it, and I tell you that it lies in your power to make use of the favorable opportunity which presents itself to make you happy." As the fairy Parabanu pronounced these last words with a different tone, and looked at the same time tenderly upon Prince Ahmed, with a modest blush on her cheeks, it was no hard matter for the prince to comprehend what happiness she meant. He presently considered that the Princess Nouronihar could never be his, and that the fairy Parabanu excelled her infinitely in beauty, agreeableness, wit, and, as much as he could conjecture by the magnificence of the palace, in immense riches. He blessed the moment that he thought of seeking after his arrow a second time, and yielding to his love. "Madam," replied he, "should I all my life have the happiness of being your slave, and the admirer of the many charms which ravish my soul, I should think myself the most blessed of men. Pardon in me the boldness which inspires me to ask this favor, and don't refuse to admit me into your court, a prince who is entirely devoted to you." "Prince," answered the fairy, "will you not pledge your faith to me, as well as I give mine to you?" "Yes, madam," replied the prince in an ecstasy of joy. "What can I do better and with greater pleasure?" "Yes, my sultaness, my queen, I'll give you my heart without the least reserve." "Then," answered the fairy, "you are my husband, and I am your wife. But, as I suppose," pursued she, "that you have eaten nothing today, a slight repast shall be served up for you, while preparations are making for our wedding feast at night. And then I will show you the apartments of my palace, and you shall judge if this hall is not the meanest part of it." Some of the fairy's women, who came into the hall with them and guessed her intentions, went immediately out, and returned presently with some excellent meats and wines. When Prince Ahmed had ate and drunk as much as he cared for, the fairy Parabanu carried him through all the apartments, where he saw diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and all sorts of fine jewels, intermixed with pearls, agate, jasper, porphyry, and all sorts of the most precious marbles. But not to mention the richness of the furniture, which was inestimable, there was such a profuseness throughout that the prince, instead of ever having seen anything like it, owned that he could not have imagined that there was anything in the world that could come up to it. "Prince," said the fairy, "if you admire my palace so much, which, indeed, is very beautiful, what would you say to the palaces of the chief of our genies, which are much more beautiful, spacious, and magnificent? I could also charm you with my gardens, but we will let that alone till another time. Night draws near, and it will be time to go to supper." The next hall which the fairy led the prince into, and where the cloth was laid for the feast, was the last apartment the prince had not seen, and not in the least inferior to the others. At his entrance into it, he admired the infinite number of sconces of wax candles perfumed with amber, the multitude of which, instead of being confused, were placed with so just a symmetry as formed an agreeable and pleasant sight. A large side table was set out with all sorts of gold plate, so finely wrought that the workmanship was much more valuable than the weight of the gold. Several choruses of beautiful women richly dressed, and whose voices were ravishing, began a concert, accompanied with all sorts of the most harmonious instruments, and when they were set down at table, the fairy Parabanu took care to help Prince Ahmed to the most delicate meats, which she named as she invited him to eat of them, and which the prince found to be so exquisitely nice that he commended them with exaggeration, and said that the entertainment far surpassed those of man. He found also the same excellence in the wines, which neither he nor the fairy tasted of till the dessert was served up, which consisted of the choicest sweetmeats and fruits. The wedding feast was continued the next day, or rather, the days following the celebration were a continual feast. At the end of 6 months, Prince Ahmed, who always loved and honored the Sultan his father, conceived a great desire to know how he was, and that desire could not be satisfied without his going to see. He told the fairy of it, and desired she would give him leave. "Prince," said she, "go when you please, but first, don't take it amiss that I give you some advice how you shall behave yourself where you are going. First, I don't think it proper for you to tell the Sultan your father of our marriage, nor of my quality, nor the place where you have been. Beg of him to be satisfied in knowing you are happy, and desire no more, and let him know that the sole end of your visit is to make him easy and inform him of your fate." She appointed 20 gentlemen, well mounted and equipped to attend him. When all was ready, Prince Ahmed took his leave of the fairy, embraced her, and renewed his promise to return soon. Then his horse, which was most finely caparisoned, and was as beautiful a creature as any in the Sultan of India's stables, was led to him, and he mounted him with an extraordinary grace, and, after he had bid her a last adieu, set forward on his journey. As it was not a great way to his father's capital, Prince Ahmed soon arrived there. The people, glad to see him again, received him with acclamations of joy, and followed him in crowds to the Sultan's apartment. The Sultan received and embraced him with great joy, complaining at the same time, with a fatherly tenderness, of the affliction his long absence had been to him, which, he said, was the more grievous for that, fortune having decided in favor of Prince Ali his brother, he was afraid he might have committed some rash action. The prince told a story of his adventures without speaking of the fairy, whom he said that he must not mention, and ended, "The only favor I ask of your majesty is to give me leave to come often and pay you my respects, and to know how you do." "Son," answered the Sultan of the Indies, "I cannot refuse you the leave you ask me, but I should much rather you would resolve to stay with me. At least tell me where I may send to you if you should fail to come, or when I may think your presence necessary." "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "what your majesty asks of me is part of the mystery I spoke to your majesty of. I beg of you to give me leave to remain silent on this head, for I shall come so frequently that I am afraid that I shall sooner be thought troublesome than be accused of negligence in my duty." The Sultan of the Indies pressed Prince Ahmed no more, but said to him, "Son, I penetrate no farther into your secrets, but leave you at your liberty, but can tell you that you could not do me a greater pleasure than to come and by your presence restore to me the joy I have not felt this long time, and that you shall always be welcome when you come, without interrupting your business or pleasure." Prince Ahmed stayed but 3 days at the Sultan his father's court, and the 4th returned to the fairy Parabanu, who did not expect him so soon. A month after Prince Ahmed's return from paying a visit to his father, as the fairy Parabanu had observed that the prince, since the time that he had given her an account of his journey, his discourse with his father, and the leave he asked to go and see him often, had never talked to the Sultan, as if there had been no such person in the world, whereas before he was always speaking of him, she thought he forbore on her account. Therefore she took an opportunity to say to him one day, "Prince, tell me, have you forgotten the Sultan your father? Don't you remember the promise you made to go and see him often? For my part, I have not forgotten what you told me at your return, and so put you in mind of it, that you may not be long before you acquit yourself of your promise." So Prince Ahmed went the next morning with the same attendants as before, but much finer, and himself more magnificently mounted, equipped, and dressed, and was received by the Sultan with the same joy and satisfaction. For several months he constantly paid his visits, always in a richer and finer equipage. At last some wazirs, the Sultan's favorites, who judged of Prince Ahmed's grandeur and power by the figure he cut, made the Sultan jealous of his son, saying it was to be feared he might inveigle himself into the people's favor and dethrone him. The Sultan of the Indies was so far from thinking that Prince Ahmed could be capable of so pernicious a design as his favorites would make him believe, that he said to them, "You are mistaken. My son loves me, and I am certain of his tenderness and fidelity, as I have given him no reason to be disgusted." But the favorites went on abusing Prince Ahmed till the Sultan said, "Be it as it will, I don't believe my son Ahmed is so wicked as you would persuade me he is. However, I am obliged to you for your good advice, and don't dispute but that it proceeds from your good intentions." The Sultan of the Indies said this that his favorites might not know the impressions their discourse had made on his mind, which had so alarmed him that he resolved to have Prince Ahmed watched unknown to his Grand Wazir. So he sent for a female magician, who was introduced by a back door into his apartment. "Go immediately," he said, "and follow my son, and watch him so well as to find out where he retires, and bring me word." The magician left the Sultan, and knowing the place where Prince Ahmed found his arrow, went immediately thither, and hid herself near the rocks, so that nobody could see her. The next morning Prince Ahmed set out by daybreak, without taking leave either of the Sultan or any of his court, according to custom. The magician, seeing him coming, followed him with her eyes, till on a sudden she lost sight of him and his attendants. As the rocks were very steep and craggy, they were an insurmountable barrier, so that the magician judged that there were but two things for it: either that the prince retired into some cavern, or an abode of genies or fairies. Thereupon she came out of the place where she was hid, and went directly to the hollow way, which she traced till she came to the farther end, looking carefully about on all sides, but, notwithstanding all her diligence, could perceive no opening, not so much as the iron gate which Prince Ahmed discovered, which was to be seen and open to none but men, and only to such whose presence was agreeable to the fairy Parabanu. The magician, who saw it was in vain for her to search any farther, was obliged to be satisfied with the discovery she had made, and returned to give the Sultan an account. The Sultan was very well pleased with the magician's conduct, and said to her, "Do you as you think fit. I await patiently the event of your promises," and to encourage her made her a present of a diamond of great value. As Prince Ahmed had obtained the fairy Parabanu's leave to go to the Sultan of the Indies court once a month, he never failed, and the magician, knowing the time, went a day or two before to the foot of the rock, where she lost sight of the prince and his attendants, and waited there. The next morning Prince Ahmed went out as usual at the iron gate with the same attendants as before, and passed by the magician, whom he knew not to be such, and, seeing her lie with her head against the rock, and complaining as if she were in great pain, he pitied her, turned his horse about, went to her, and asked her what was the matter with her, and what he could do to ease her. The artful sorceress looked at the prince in a pitiful manner, without ever lifting up her head, and answered in broken words and sighs, as if she could hardly fetch her breath, that she was going to the capital city, but on the way thither she was taken with so violent a fever that her strength failed her, and she was forced to lie down, where he saw her, far from any habitation, and without any hopes of assistance. "Good woman," replied Prince Ahmed, "you are not so far from help as you imagine. I am ready to assist you, and convey you where you will meet with a speedy cure. Only get up, and let one of my people take you behind him." At these words the magician, who pretended sickness, only to know where the prince lived and what he did, refused not the charitable offer he made her, and, that her actions might correspond with her words, she made many pretended vain endeavors to get up. At the same time, two of the prince's attendants, alighting off their horses, helped her up, and set her behind another, and mounted their horses again, and followed the prince, who turned back to the iron gate, which was opened by one of his retinue who rode before. And when he came into the outward court of the fairy, without dismounting himself, he sent to tell her he wanted to speak with her. The fairy Parabanu came with all imaginable haste, not knowing what made Prince Ahmed return so soon, who, not giving her time to ask him the reason, said, "Princess, I desire you would have compassion on this good woman," pointing to the magician, who was held up by two of his retinue. "I found her in the condition you see her in, and promised her the assistance she stands in need of, and am persuaded that you, out of your own goodness, as well as upon my entreaty, will not abandon her." The fairy Parabanu, who had her eyes fixed upon the pretended sick woman all the time that the prince was talking to her, ordered two of her women who followed her to take her from the two men that held her, and carry her into an apartment of the palace, and take as much care of her as she would herself. While the two women executed the fairy's commands, she went up to Prince Ahmed, and, whispering in his ear, said, "Prince, this woman is not so sick as she pretends to be, and I am very much mistaken if she is not an impostor who will be the cause of great trouble to you. But don't be concerned. Let what will be devised against you. Be persuaded that I will deliver you out of all the snares that shall be laid for you. Go and pursue your journey." This discourse of the fairies did not in the least frighten Prince Ahmed. "My princess," said he, "as I do not remember I ever did or designed anybody an injury, I cannot believe anybody can have a thought of doing me one. But if they have, I shall not nevertheless forbear doing good whenever I have an opportunity." Then he went back to his father's palace. In the meantime, the two women carried the magician into a very fine apartment, richly furnished. First they sat her down upon a sofa, with her back supported with a cushion of gold brocade, while they made a bed on the same sofa before her, the quilt of which was finely embroidered with silk, the sheets of the finest linen, and the coverlet cloth of gold. When they had put her into bed, for the old sorceress pretended that her fever was so violent she could not help herself in the least, one of the women went out, and returned soon again with a china dish in her hand full of a certain liquor, which she presented to the magician, while the other helped her to sit up. "Drink this liquor," said she. "It is the water of the fountain of lions, and a sovereign remedy against all fevers whatsoever. You will find the effect of it in less than an hour's time." The magician, to dissemble the better, took it after a great deal of entreaty, but at last she took the china dish, and holding back her head, swallowed down the liquor. When she was laid down again, the two women covered her up. "Lie quiet," said she who brought her the china cup, "and get a little sleep if you can. We'll leave you, and hope to find you perfectly cured when we come again an hour hence." The two women came again at the time they said they should, and found the magician up and dressed and sitting upon the sofa. "O admirable potion," she said, "it has wrought its cure much sooner than you told me it would, and I shall be able to prosecute my journey." The two women, who were fairies as well as their mistress, after they had told the magician how glad they were that she was cured so soon, walked before her and conducted her through several apartments, all more noble than that wherein she lay, into a large hall, the most richly and magnificently furnished of all the palace. Fairy Parabanu sat in this hall on a throne of massive gold, enriched with diamonds, rubies, and pearls of an extraordinary size, and attended on each hand by a great number of beautiful fairies, all richly clothed. At the sight of so much majesty, the magician was not only dazzled, but was so amazed that, after she had prostrated herself before the throne, she could not open her lips to thank the fairy as she proposed. However, Parabanu saved her the trouble, and said to her, "Good woman, I am glad I had an opportunity to oblige you, and to see you are able to pursue your journey. I won't detain you, but perhaps you may not be displeased to see my palace. Follow my women, and they will show it to you." Then the magician went back, and related to the Sultan of the Indies all that had happened, and how very rich Prince Ahmed was since his marriage with the fairy, richer than all the kings in the world, and how there was danger that he should come and take the throne from his father. Though the Sultan of the Indies was very well persuaded that Prince Ahmed's natural disposition was good, yet he could not help being concerned at the discourse of the old sorceress, to whom, when she was taking her leave, he said, "I thank thee for the pains thou hast taken, and thy wholesome advice. I am so sensible of the great importance it is to me, that I shall deliberate upon it in council." Now, the favorites advised that the prince should be killed, but the magician advised differently. "Make him give you all kinds of wonderful things, by the fairy's help, till she tires of him and sends him away. As, for example, every time your majesty goes into the field, you are obliged to be at a great expense, not only in pavilions and tents for your army, but likewise in mules and camels to carry their baggage. Now, might not you engage him to use his interest with the fairy to procure you a tent which might be carried in a man's hand, and which should be so large as to shelter your whole army against bad weather?" When the magician had finished her speech, the Sultan asked his favorites if they had anything better to propose, and, finding them all silent, determined to follow the magician's advice as the most reasonable and most agreeable to his mild government. Next day, the Sultan did as the magician had advised him, and asked for the pavilion. Prince Ahmed never expected that the Sultan his father would have asked such a thing, which at first appeared so difficult, not to say impossible. Though he knew not absolutely how great the power of genies and fairies was, he doubted whether it extended so far as to compass such a tent as his father desired. At last he replied, "Though it is with the greatest reluctance imaginable, I will not fail to ask the favor of my wife your majesty desires, but will not promise you to obtain it, and if I should not have the honor to come again to pay you my respects, that shall be the sign that I have not had success. But beforehand, I desire you to forgive me, and consider that you yourself have reduced me to this extremity." "Son," replied the Sultan of the Indies, "I should be very sorry if what I ask of you should cause me the displeasure of never seeing you more. I find you don't know the power a husband has over a wife, and yours would show her that her love to you was very indifferent if she, with the power she has of a fairy, should refuse you so trifling a request as this I desire you to ask of her for my sake." The prince went back, and was very sad for fear of offending the fairy. She kept pressing him to tell her what was the matter, and at last he said, "Madam, you may have observed that hitherto I have been content with your love, and have never asked you any other favor. Consider then, I conjure you, that it is not I, but the Sultan my father, who indiscreetly, or at least I think so, begs of you a pavilion large enough to shelter him, his court, and army from the violence of the weather, and which a man may carry in his hand. But remember, it is the Sultan my father asks this favor." "Prince," replied the fairy, smiling, "I am sorry that so small a matter should disturb you, and make you so uneasy as you appeared to me." Then the fairy sent for her treasurer, to whom, when she came, she said, "Norghan," which was her name, "bring me the largest pavilion in my treasury." Norgam returned presently with the pavilion, which she could not only hold in her hand, but in the palm of her hand when she shut her fingers, and presented it to her mistress, who gave it to Prince Ahmed to look at. When Prince Ahmed saw the pavilion which the fairy called the largest in her treasury, he fancied she had a mind to jest with him, and thereupon the marks of his surprise appeared presently in his countenance, which Parabanu perceived, burst out laughing. "What, Prince," cried she, "do you think I jest with you? You'll see presently that I am in earnest. Norgan," said she to her treasurer, taking the tent out of Prince Ahmed's hands, "go and set it up, that the prince may judge whether it may be large enough for the Sultan his father." The treasurer went immediately with it out of the palace, and carried it a great way off, and when she had set it up, one end reached to the very palace, at which time the prince, thinking it small, found it large enough to shelter 2 greater armies than that of the Sultan his father's, and then said to Parabanu, "I ask my princess 1,000 pardons for my incredulity. After what I have seen and believed, there is nothing impossible to you." "You see," said the fairy, "that the pavilion is larger than what your father may have occasion for you must know that it has one property, that it is larger or smaller according to the army it is to cover." The treasurer took down the tent again, and brought it to the prince, who took it, and without staying any longer than till the next day, mounted his horse, and went with the same attendants to the Sultan his father. The Sultan, who was persuaded that there could not be any such thing as such a tent as he asked for, was in great surprise at the prince's diligence. He took the tent, and after he had admired its smallness, his amazement was so great that he could not recover himself. When the tent was set up in the great plain which we have before mentioned, he found it large enough to shelter an army twice as large as he could bring into the field. But the Sultan was not yet satisfied. "Son," said he, "I have already expressed to you how much I am obliged to you for the present of the tent you have procured me, that I look upon it as the most valuable thing in all my treasury. But you must do one thing more for me, which will be every whit as agreeable to me. I am informed that the fairy, your spouse, makes use of a certain water called the water of the Fountain of Lions, which cures all sorts of fevers, even the most dangerous, and, as I am perfectly well persuaded my health is dear to you, I don't doubt but you will ask her for a bottle of that water for me, and bring it to me as a sovereign medicine, which I may make use of when I have occasion. Do me this other important piece of service, and thereby complete the duty of a good son toward a tender father." The prince returned and told the fairy what his father had said. "There's a great deal of wickedness in this demand," she answered, "as you will understand by what I am going to tell you. The Fountain of Lions is situated in the middle of a court of a great castle, the entrance into which is guarded by 4 fierce lions, 2 of which sleep alternately, while the other 2 are awake. But don't let that frighten you. I'll give you means to pass by them without any danger." The fairy Parabanu was at that time very hard at work, and as she had several clues of thread by her, she took up one, and presenting it to Prince Ahmed, said, "First take this clue of thread. I'll tell you presently the use of it. In the second place, you must have 2 horses. One you must ride yourself, and the other you must lead, which must be loaded with a sheep cut into 4 quarters that must be killed today. In the third place, you must be provided with a bottle, which I will give you to bring the water in. Set out early tomorrow morning, and when you have passed the iron gate, throw the clue of thread before you, which will roll till it comes to the gates of the castle. Follow it, and when it stops, as the gates will be open, you will see the 4 lions. The 2 that are awake will by their roaring wake the other 2. But don't be frightened. Throw each of them a quarter of mutton, and then clap spurs to your horse and ride to the fountain. Fill your bottle without alighting, and then return with the same expedition. The lions will be so busy eating, they will let you pass by them." Prince Ahmed set out the next morning at the time appointed by the fairy, and followed her directions exactly. When he arrived at the gates of the castle, he distributed the quarters of mutton among the 4 lions, and passing through the midst of them bravely, got to the fountain, filled his bottle, and returned back as safe and sound as he went. When he had gone a little distance from the castle gates, he turned him about, and perceiving two of the lions coming after him, he drew his sabre and prepared himself for defence. But as he went forward, he saw one of them turned out of the road at some distance, and showed by his head and tail that he did not come to do him any harm, but only to go before him, and that the other stayed behind to follow. He put his sword up again in its scabbard. Guarded in this manner, he arrived at the capital of the Indies, but the lions never left him till they had conducted him to the gates of the Sultan's palace, after which they returned the same way they came, though not without frightening all that saw them, for all they went in a very gentle manner, and showed no fierceness. A great many officers came to attend the prince while he dismounted his horse, and afterward conducted him into the Sultan's apartment, who was at that time surrounded with his favourites. He approached toward the throne, laid the bottle at the Sultan's feet, and kissed the rich tapestry which covered his footstool, and then said, "I have brought you, sir, the healthful water which your Majesty desired so much to keep among your other rarities in your treasury, but at the same time wish you such extraordinary health as never to have occasion to make use of it." After the prince had made an end of his compliment, the Sultan placed him on his right hand, and then said to him, "Son, I am very much obliged to you for this valuable present, as also for the great danger you have exposed yourself to upon my account, which I have been informed of by a magician who knows the Fountain of Lions. But do me the pleasure," continued he, "to inform me by what address, or rather by what incredible power, you have been secured." "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "I have no share in the compliment your Majesty is pleased to make me. All the honor is due to the fairy my spouse, whose good advice I followed." Then he informed the Sultan what those directions were, and by the relation of this, his expedition let him know how well he had behaved himself. When he had done, the Sultan, who showed outwardly all the demonstrations of great joy, but secretly became more jealous, retired into an inward apartment, where he sent for the magician. The magician, at her arrival, saved the Sultan the trouble to tell her of the success of Prince Ahmed's journey, which she had heard of before she came, and therefore was prepared with an infallible means, as she pretended. This means she communicated to the Sultan, who declared it the next day to the prince, in the midst of all his courtiers, in these words: "Son," said he, "I have one thing more to ask of you, after which I shall expect nothing more from your obedience nor your interest with your wife. This request is, to bring me a man not above 1.5 feet high, and whose beard is 30 feet long, who carries a bar of iron upon his shoulders of 500 weight, which he uses as a quarterstaff." Prince Ahmed, who did not believe that there was such a man in the world as his father described, would gladly have excused himself, but the Sultan persisted in this demand, and told him the fairy could do more incredible things. The next day the prince returned to his dear Parabanu, to whom he told his father's new demand, which, he said, he looked upon to be a thing more impossible than the first two, for, added he, "I cannot imagine there can be such a man in the world. Without doubt he has a mind to try whether or no I am so silly as to go about it, or he has a design on my ruin. In short, how can he suppose that I should lay behold of a man so well armed, though he is but little? What arms can I make use of to reduce him to my will? If there are any means, I beg you will tell them, and let me come off with honor this time." "Don't affright yourself, Prince," replied the fairy. "You ran a risk in fetching the water of the Fountain of Lions for your father, but there's no danger in finding out this man, who is my brother Shaibar, but is so far from being like me, though we both have the same father, that he is of so violent a nature that nothing can prevent him giving cruel marks of his resentment for a slight offense, yet on the other hand is so good as to oblige anyone in whatever they desire. He is made exactly as the Sultan your father has described him, and he has no other arms than a bar of iron of 500 pounds weight, without which he never stirs, and which makes him respected. I'll send for him, and you shall judge of the truth of what I tell you. But be sure to prepare yourself against being frightened at his extraordinary figure when you see him." "What? My queen?" replied Prince Ahmed. "Do you say Shaibar is your brother? Let him be never so ugly or deformed, I shall be so far from being frightened at the sight of him that, as our brother, I shall honor and love him." The fairy ordered a gold chafing dish to be set with a fire in it under the porch of her palace, with a box of the same metal, which was a present to her, out of which, taking a perfume and throwing it into the fire, there arose a thick cloud of smoke. Some moments after, the fairy said to Princess Ahmed, "See, there comes my brother." The prince immediately perceived Schaibar coming gravely with his heavy bar on his shoulder, his long beard which he held up before him, and a pair of thick mustachios which he tucked behind his ears and almost covered his face. His eyes were very small and deep-set in his head, which was far from being of the smallest size, and on his head he wore a grenadier's cap. Besides all this, he was very much hump-backed. If Prince Ahmed had not known that Schaibar was Parabanu's brother, he would not have been able to have looked at him without fear. But knowing first who he was, he stood by the fairy without the least concern. Schaibar, as he came forward, looked at the prince earnestly, enough to have chilled his blood in his veins, and asked Parabanu, when he first accosted her, who that man was. To which she replied, "He is my husband, brother. His name is Ahmed. He is son to the Sultan of the Indies. The reason why I did not invite you to my wedding was I was unwilling to divert you from an expedition you were engaged in, and from which I heard with pleasure you returned victorious, and so took the liberty now to call for you." At these words, Schaibar, looking on Prince Ahmed favorably, said, "Is there anything else, sister, wherein I can serve him? It is enough for me that he is your husband to engage me to do for him whatever he desires." "The Sultan, his father," replied Parabanu, "has a curiosity to see you, and I desire he may be your guide to the Sultan's court." "He needs but lead me the way, I'll follow him." "Brother," replied Parabanu, "it is too late to go today, therefore stay till tomorrow morning, and in the meantime I'll inform you of all that has passed between the Sultan of the Indies and Prince Ahmed since our marriage." The next morning, after Schaibar had been informed of the affair, he and Prince Ahmed set out for the Sultan's court. When they arrived at the gates of the capital, the people no sooner saw Schaibar but they ran and hid themselves, and some shut up their shops and locked themselves up in their houses, while others, flying, communicated their fear to all they met, who stayed not to look behind them, but ran too. Insomuch that Schaibar and Prince Ahmed, as they went along, found the streets all desolate, till they came to the palaces, where the porters, instead of keeping the gates, ran away too, so that the prince and Schaibar advanced without any obstacle to the council hall, where the Sultan was seated on his throne and giving audience. Here likewise the ushers, at the approach of Schaibar, abandoned their posts and gave them free admittance. Schaibar went boldly and fiercely up to the throne, without waiting to be presented by Prince Ahmed, and accosted the Sultan of the Indies in these words. "Thou hast asked for me," said he. "See, here I am. What wouldst thou have with me?" The Sultan, instead of answering him, clapped his hands before his eyes to avoid the sight of so terrible an object, at which uncivil and rude reception Schaibar was so much provoked, after he had given him the trouble to come so far, that he instantly lifted up his iron bar and killed him before Prince Ahmed could intercede in his behalf. All that he could do was to prevent his killing the Grand Wazir, who sat not far from him, representing to him that he had always given the Sultan his father good advice. "These are they, then," said Schaibar, "who gave him bad." And as he pronounced these words, he killed all the other wazirs and flattering favorites of the Sultan, who were Prince Ahmed's enemies. Every time he struck, he killed someone or other, and none escaped but they who were not so frightened as to stand staring and gaping, and who saved themselves by flight. When this terrible execution was over, Schaibar came out of the council hall into the midst of the courtyard with the iron bar upon his shoulder, and, looking hard at the Grand Wazir, who owed his life to Prince Ahmed, he said, "I know here is a certain magician who is a greater enemy of my brother-in-law than all these base favorites I have chastised. Let the magician be brought to me presently." The Grand Wazir immediately sent for her, and as soon as she was brought, Schaibar said, at the time he fetched a stroke at her with his iron bar, "Take the reward of thy pernicious counsel, and learn to feign sickness again." After this, he said, "This is not yet enough. I will use the whole town after the same manner if they do not immediately acknowledge Prince Ahmed, my brother-in-law, for their Sultan and the Sultan of the Indies." Then all that were there present made the air echo again with the repeated acclamations of "Long life to Sultan Ahmed," and immediately after he was proclaimed through the whole town. Schaibar made him be clothed in the royal vestments, installed him on the throne, and after he had caused all to swear homage and fidelity to him, went and fetched his sister Parabanu, whom he brought with all the pomp and grandeur imaginable, and made her to be owned Sultaness of the Indies. As for Prince Ali, and Princess Nuranahar, as they had no hand in the conspiracy against Prince Ahmed and knew nothing of any, Prince Ahmed assigned them a considerable province with its capital, where they spent the rest of their lives. Afterwards, he sent an officer to Prince Hossein to acquaint him with the change and make him an offer of which province he liked best. But that prince thought himself so happy in his solitude that he bade the officer return the Sultan his brother thanks for the kindness he designed him, assuring him of his submission, and that the only favor he desired of him was to give him leave to live retired in the place he had made choice of for his retreat. The end. Read by Rick Kishner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Story of Prince Ahmed and the Fairy Paranaboo 1. From the Blue Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. There was a sultan who had 3 sons and a niece. The eldest of the princes was called Hossein, the second Ali, the youngest Ahmed, and the princess his niece Nuranahar. The Princess Nuranahar was the daughter of the younger brother of the Sultan, who died and left the princess very young. The Sultan took upon himself the care of his daughter's education, and brought her up in his palace with the 3 princes, proposing to marry her when she arrived at a proper age, and to contract an alliance with some neighboring prince by that means. But when he perceived that the 3 princes, his sons, loved her passionately, he thought more seriously on that affair. He was very much concerned. The difficulty he foresaw was to make them agree, and that the 2 youngest should consent to yield her up to their elder brother. As he found them positively obstinate, he sent for them all together, and said to them, "Children, since for your good and quiet I have not been able to persuade you no longer to aspire to the princess, your cousin, I think it would not be amiss if everyone traveled separately into different countries, so that you might not meet each other. And as you know I am very curious, and delight in everything that's singular, I promise my niece in marriage to him that shall bring me the most extraordinary rarity. And for the purchase of the rarity you shall go in search after, and the expense of traveling, I will give you every one a sum of money." As the 3 princes were always submissive and obedient to the Sultan's will, and each flattered himself fortune might prove favorable to him, they all consented to it. The Sultan paid them the money he promised them, and that very day they gave orders for the preparations for their travels, and took their leave of the Sultan, that they might be the more ready to go the next morning. Accordingly, they all set out at the same gate of the city, each dressed like a merchant, attended by an officer of confidence dressed like a slave, and all well mounted and equipped. They went the first day's journey together, and lay all at an inn where the road was divided into 3 different tracts. At night, when they were at supper together, they all agreed to travel for a year, and to meet at that inn, and that the first that came should wait for the rest, that, as they had all 3 taken their leave together of the Sultan, they might all return together. The next morning, by break of day, after they had embraced and wished each other good success, they mounted their horses and took each a different road. Prince Hossein, the eldest brother, arrived at Biznagar, the capital of the kingdom of that name, and the resident of its king. He went and lodged at a khan appointed for foreign merchants, and, having learned that there were 4 principal divisions where merchants of all sorts sold their commodities and kept shops, and in the midst of which stood the castle, or rather the king's palace, he went to one of these divisions the next day. Prince Hossein could not view this division without admiration. It was large and divided into several streets, all vaulted and shaded from the sun, and yet very light too. The shops were all of a size, and all that dealt in the same sort of goods lived in one street, as also the handicraftsmen who kept their shops in the smaller streets. The multitude of shops stocked with all sorts of merchandise, as the finest linens from several parts of India, some painted in the most lively colors, and representing beasts, trees, and flowers, silks and brocades from Persia, China, and other places, porcelain both from Japan and China, and tapestries, surprised him so much that he knew not how to believe his own eyes. But when he came to the goldsmiths and jewelers, he was in a kind of ecstasy to behold such prodigious quantities of wrought gold and silver, and was dazzled by the luster of the pearls, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and other jewels exposed for sale. Another thing Prince Hossein particularly admired was the great number of rose sellers who crowded the streets, for the Indians are so great lovers of that flower that no one will stir without a nosegay in his hand or a garland on his head, and the merchants keep them in pots in their shops that the air is perfectly perfumed. After Prince Hossein had run through that division street by street, his thoughts fully employed on the riches he had seen, he was very much tired, which, a merchant perceiving, civilly invited him to sit down in his shop, and he accepted, but had not been sat down long before he saw a crier pass by with a piece of tapestry on his arm, about 6 feet square, and cried at 30 purses. The prince called to the crier, and asked to see the tapestry, which seemed to him to be valued at an exorbitant price, not only for the size of it, but the meanness of the stuff. When he had examined it well, he told the crier that he could not comprehend how so small a piece of tapestry and of so indifferent appearance could be set at so high a price. The crier, who took him for a merchant, replied, "If this price seems so extravagant to you, your amazement will be greater when I tell you I have orders to raise it to 40 purses, and not to part with it under." "Certainly," answered Prince Hossein, "it must have something very extraordinary in it, which I know nothing of." "You have guessed it, sir," replied the crier, "and will own it when you come to know that whoever sits on this piece of tapestry may be transported in an instant wherever he desires to be, without being stopped by any obstacle." At this discourse of the crier, the Prince of the Indies, considering that the principal motive of his travel was to carry the Sultan his father home some singular rarity, thought that he could not meet with any which would give him more satisfaction. "If the tapestry," said he to the crier, "has the virtue you assign it, I shall not think 40 purses too much, but shall make you a present besides." "Sir," replied the crier, "I have told you the truth, and it is an easy matter to convince you of it, as soon as you have made the bargain for 40 purses, on condition I show you the experiment. But, as I suppose you have not so much about you, and to receive them I must go with you to your khan, where you lodge, with the leave of the master of the shop, we will go into the back shop, and I will spread the tapestry, and when we have both sat down, and you have formed the wish to be transported into your apartment of the khan, if we are not transported thither, it shall be no bargain, and you shall be at your liberty. As to your present, though I am paid for my trouble by the seller, I shall receive it as a favor, and be very much obliged to you, and thankful." On the credit of the crier, the prince accepted the conditions and concluded the bargain, and, having got the master's leave, they went into his back shop. They both sat down on it, and as soon as the prince formed his wish to be transported into his apartment at the khan, he presently found himself and the crier there. And as he wanted not a more sufficient proof of the virtue of the tapestry, he counted the crier out 40 pieces of gold, and gave him 20 pieces for himself. In this manner Prince Hossein became the possessor of the tapestry, and was overjoyed that at his arrival at Bisnagar he had found so rare a piece, which he never disputed would gain him the hand of Naranahar. In short, he looked upon it as an impossible thing for the princes his younger brothers to meet with anything to be compared with it. It was in his power, by sitting on his tapestry, to be at the place of meeting that very day. But, as he was obliged to stay there for his brothers, as they had agreed, and as he was curious to see the king of Bisnagar and his court, and to inform himself of the strength, laws, customs, and religion of the kingdom, he chose to make a longer abode there, and to spend some months in satisfying his curiosity. Prince Hossein might have made a longer abode in the kingdom and court of Bisnagar, but he was so eager to be nearer the princess that, spreading the tapestry, he and the officer he had brought with him sat down, and as soon as he had formed his wish, were transported to the inn at which he and his brothers were to meet, and where he passed for a merchant till they came. Prince Ali, Prince Hossein's second brother, who designed to travel into Persia, took the road, having 3 days after he parted with his brothers, joined a caravan, and after 4 days' travel arrived at Shiraz, which was the capital of the kingdom of Persia. Here he passed for a jeweler. The next morning Prince Ali, who traveled only for his pleasure, and had brought nothing but just necessaries along with him after he had dressed himself, took a walk into that part of the town which they at Shiraz called the Bezestein. Among all the criers who passed backward and forward with several sorts of goods, offering to sell them, He was not a little surprised to see one who held an ivory telescope in his hand of about a foot in length and the thickness of a man's thumb, and cried it at 30 purses. At first he thought the crier mad, and to inform himself went to a shop and said to the merchant who stood at the door, "Pray, sir, is not that man," pointing to the crier who cried the ivory perspective glass at 30 purses, "mad? If he is not, I am very much deceived." "Indeed, sir," answered the merchant, "he was in his right senses yesterday. I can assure you he is one of the ablest criers we have, and the most employed of any when anything valuable is to be sold. And if he cries the ivory perspective glass at 30 purses, it must be worth as much or more on some account or other. He will come by presently, and we will call him, and you shall be satisfied. In the meantime, sit down on my sofa and rest yourself." Prince Ali accepted the merchant's obliging offer, and presently afterward the crier passed by. The merchant called him by his name, and, pointing to the prince, said to him, "Tell that gentleman who asked me if you were in your right senses what you mean by crying that ivory perspective glass, which seems not to be worth much, at 30 purses. I should be very much amazed myself if I did not know you." The crier, addressing himself to Prince Ali, said, "Sir, you are not the only person that takes me for a madman on account of this perspective glass. You shall judge yourself whether I am or no when I have told you its property, and I hope you will value it as high a price as those I have showed it to already, who had as bad an opinion of me as you. First, sir," pursued the crier, presenting the ivory pipe to the prince, "observe that this pipe is furnished with a glass at both ends, and consider that by looking through one of them you can see whatever object you wish to behold." "I am," said the prince, "ready to make you all imaginable reparation for the scandal I have thrown on you, if you will make the truth of what you advance appear." And as he had the ivory pipe in his hand, after he had looked at the two glasses, he said, "Show me at which of these ends I must look, that I may be satisfied." The crier presently showed him, and he looked through, wishing at the same time to see the Sultan his father, whom he immediately beheld in perfect health, set on his throne in the midst of his council. Afterward, as there was nothing in the world so dear to him, after the Sultan, as the Princess Nuranihar, he wished to see her, and saw her at her toilet, laughing, and in a pleasant humor with her women about her. Prince Ali wanted no other proof to be persuaded that this perspective glass was the most valuable thing in the world, and believed that if he should neglect to purchase it, he should never meet again with such another rarity. He therefore took the crier with him to the khan where he lodged, and counted him out the money, and received the perspective glass. Prince Ali was overjoyed at his bargain, and persuaded himself that, as his brothers would not be able to meet with anything so rare and admirable, the Princess Nuranihar would be the recompense of his fatigue and trouble, that he thought of nothing but visiting the court of Persia incognito, and seeing whatever was curious in Shiraz and thereabouts, till the caravan with which he came returned back to the Indies. As soon as the caravan was ready to set out, the prince joined them, and arrived happily without any incident or trouble, otherwise than the length of the journey and fatigue of traveling, at the place of rendezvous, where he found Prince Hussein, and both waited for Prince Ahmed. Prince Ahmed, who took the road of Samarkand the next day after his arrival there, went, as his brothers had done, into the Bezestein, where he had not walked long, but heard a crier who had an artificial apple in his hand cry it at 35 purses, upon which he stopped the crier and said to him, "Let me see that apple, and tell me what virtue and extraordinary properties it has to be valued at so high a rate." "Sir," said the crier, giving it into his hand, "if you look at the outside of this apple, it is very worthless. But if you consider its properties, virtues, and the great use and benefit it is to mankind, you will say it is no price for it, and that he who possesses it is a master of great treasure. In short, it cures all sick persons of the most mortal diseases, and if the patient is dying, it will recover him immediately and restore him to perfect health. And this is done after the easiest manner in the world, which is by the patient's smelling the apple." "If I may believe you," replied Prince Ahmed, "the virtues of this apple are wonderful, and it is invaluable. But what ground have I, for all you tell me, to be persuaded of the truth of this matter?" "Sir," replied the crier, "the thing is known and averred by the whole city of Samarcand. But without going any further, ask all these merchants you see here, and hear what they say. You will find several of them will tell you that they had not been alive this day if they had not made use of this excellent remedy. And, that you may better comprehend what it is, I must tell you it is the fruit of the study and experiments of a celebrated philosopher of this city, who applied himself all his lifetime to the study and knowledge of the virtues of plants and minerals, and at last attained to this composition, by which he performed such surprising cures in this town as will never be forgot, but died suddenly himself before he could apply his sovereign remedy, and left his wife and a great many young children behind him in very indifferent circumstances, who, to support her family and provide for her children, is resolved to sell it." While the crier informed Prince Ahmed of the virtues of the artificial apple, a great many persons came about them and confirmed what he said. And one amongst the rest said he had a friend dangerously ill whose life was despaired of, and that was a favorable opportunity to show Prince Ahmed the experiment, upon which Prince Ahmed told the crier he would give him 40 purses if he cured the sick person. The crier, who had orders to sell it at that price, said to Prince Ahmed, "Come, sir, let us go and make the experiment, and the apple shall be yours, and I can assure you that it will always have the desired effect." In short, the experiment succeeded, and the prince, after he had counted out to the crier 40 purses, and he had delivered the apple to him, waited patiently for the first caravan that should return to the Indies, and arrived in perfect health at the inn where the Princes Hossein and Ali waited for him. When the princes met, they showed each other their treasures, and immediately saw through the glass that the princess was dying. They then sat down on the carpet, wished themselves with her, and were there in a moment. Prince Ahmed no sooner perceived himself in Naranahar's chamber than he rose off the tapestry, as did also the other 2 princes, and went to the bedside and put the apple under her nose. Some moments after, the princess opened her eyes and turned her head from one side to another, looking at the persons who stood about her, and then rose up in the bed and asked to be dressed, just as if she had waked out of a sound sleep. Her women having presently informed her in a manner that showed their joy that she was obliged to the 3 princes for the sudden recovery of her health, and particularly to Prince Ahmed, she immediately expressed her joy to see them, and thanked them all together, and afterward Prince Ahmed in particular. While the princess was dressing, the princes went to throw themselves at the Sultan their father's feet, and pay their respects to him. But when they came before him, they found he had been informed of their arrival by the chief of the princess's eunuchs, and by what means the princess had been perfectly cured. The Sultan received and embraced them with the greatest joy, both for their return and the recovery of the princess his niece, whom he loved as well as if she had been his own daughter, and who had been given over by the physicians. After the usual ceremonies and compliments, the princes presented each his rarity. Prince Hossein his tapestry, which he had taken care not to leave behind him in the princess's chamber, Prince Ali his ivory perspective glass, and Prince Ahmed his artificial apple. And after each had commended their present, when they put it into the Sultan's hands, they begged of him to pronounce their fate, and declare to which of them he would give the Princess Nuranahar for a wife, according to his promise. The Sultan of the Indies, having heard without interrupting them all that the princes could represent further about their rarities, and being well informed of what had happened in relation to the Princess Nuranahar's cure, remained some time silent, as if he were thinking on what answer he should make. At last he broke the silence and said to them, "I would declare for one of you children with a great deal of pleasure, if I could do it with justice. But consider whether I can do it or no. 'Tis true, Prince Ahmed, the princess my niece is obliged to your artificial apple for her cure, but I must ask you whether or no you could have been so serviceable to her if you had not known by Prince Ali's perspective glass the danger she was in, and if Prince Hossein's tapestry had not brought you so soon. Your perspective glass, Prince Ali, informed you and your brothers that you were like to lose the princess your cousin, and there you must owe a great obligation. You must also grant that that knowledge would have been of no service without the artificial apple and the tapestry. And lastly, Prince Hossein, the princess would be very ungrateful if she should not show her acknowledgment of the service of your tapestry, which was so necessary a means towards her cure. But consider, it would have been of little use if you had not been acquainted with the princess's illness by Prince Ali's glass, and Prince Ahmed had not applied his artificial apple. Therefore, as neither tapestry, ivory perspective glass, nor artificial apple have the least preference one before the other, but on the contrary, there's a perfect equality, I cannot grant the princess to ally one of you. And the only fruit you have reaped from your travels is the glory of having equally contributed to restore her health. If all this be true, added the Sultan, you see that I must have recourse to other means to determine certainly in the choice I ought to make among you, and that, as there is time enough between this and night, I'll do it today. Go and get each of you a bow and arrow, and repair to the great plain where they exercise horses. I'll soon come to you and declare I will give the Princess Nuranihar to him that shoots the farthest. The three princes had nothing to say against the decision of the Sultan. When they were out of his presence, they each provided themselves with a bow and arrow, which they delivered to one of their officers, and went to the plain appointed, followed by a great concourse of people. The Sultan did not make them wait long for him, and as soon as he arrived, Prince Hossein, as the eldest, took his bow and arrow and shot first. Prince Ali shot next, and much beyond him, and Prince Ahmed last of all. But it so happened that nobody could see where his arrow fell, and notwithstanding all the diligence that was used by himself and everybody else, it was not to be found far or near. And though it was believed that he shot the farthest, and that he therefore deserved the Princess Nuranihar, it was, however, necessary that his arrow should be found to make the matter more evident and certain. And, notwithstanding his remonstrance, the Sultan judged in favor of Prince Ali, and gave orders for preparations to be made for the wedding, which was celebrated a few days after with great magnificence. Prince Hossein would not honor the feast with his presence. In short, his grief was so violent and insupportable that he left the court and renounced all rights of succession to the crown to turn hermit. Prince Ahmed, too, did not come to Prince Ali's and the Princess Nuranihar's wedding any more than his brother Hossein, but did not renounce the world as he had done. But, as he could not imagine what had become of his arrow, he stole away from his attendants and resolved to search after it, that he might not have anything to reproach himself with. With this intent, he went to the place where the Princes Hussein and Ali's were gathered up, and going straight forward from there, looking carefully on both sides of him, he went so far that at last he began to think his labor was all in vain. But yet he could not help going forward till he came to some steep, craggy rocks, which were bounds to his journey, and were situated in a barren country about 4 leagues distant from where he set out. The end of the story of Prince Ahmed and the Fairy Paranaboo, Part 1. Read by Rick Kistner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.
The Red Etin. There were ance 2 widows that lived on a small bit of ground which they rented from a farmer. Ane of them had 2 sons, and the other had ane, and by it was time for the wife that had the 2 sons to send them away to seek their fortune. So she told her eldest son a day to take a can and bring her water from the well, that she might bake a cake for him, and however much or however little water he might bring, the cake would be great or small accordingly, and the cake was to be all that she could gie him when he went on his travels. The lad guyed away with the can to the well, and filled it with water, and then came way home again, but the can being broken, the maist part of the water had run out before he got back. So his cake was very small. Yet small as it was, his mother asked if he was willing to take the half of it with her blessing, telling him that if he chose rather to have the hell, he would only get it with her curse. The young man, thinking he might hae to travel a far way, and not knowing when or how he might get other provision, said he would like to hae the hale cake, calm of his mother's malison what like. So she gave him the hale cake and her malison alang to it. Then he took his brither aside and gave him a knife to keep till he should come back, desiring him to look at it every morning, and as lang as it continued to be clear, Then he might be sure that the owner of it would well. But if it grew dim and rusty, then for certain some ill had befallen him. So the young man set out to seek his fortune, and he gaed that day, and the next day, and on the third day in the afternoon, he came up to where a shepherd was sitting with flock of sheep. And he gaed up to the shepherd and asked him wha the sheep belanged to. And the man answered, The Red Aiton of Ireland. Aince lived in Belligan, and stole King Malcolm's daughter. The king of fair Scotland, he beats her, he binds her, he lays her on a band, and every day he dings her with a bright silver wand. Like Julian the Roman, he's one that fears no man. It's said there's ane predestinate to be his mortal foe, but that man is yet unborn, and lang may be it so. The young man then went on his journey, and he had not gone far when he espied an old man with white locks, herding a flock of swine, and he gaed up to him, and asked whose swine these were. When the man answered, The Red Aiton of Ireland, aince lived in Belligan, and stole King Malcolm's daughter. The king of fair Scotland, he beats her, he binds her, he lays her on a band, and every day he dings her with a bright yellow wand. Like Julian the Roman, he fears not any man. It's said there's ane predestinate to be his mortal foe, but that man is yet unborn, and lang may it be so. Then the young man gaed on a bit farther, and he came by to another very old man herding goats, and when he asked whose goats they were, the answer was, The Red Aiton of Ireland aince lived in Belligan, and stole King Malcolm's daughter, the king of fair Scotland. He baits her, he binds her, he lays her on a band, and every day he dings her with a bright silver wand. Like Julian the Roman, he's one that fears no man. It's said there's ane predestinate to be his mortal foe, but that man is yet unborn, and lang may it be so. This old man also told him to beware of the next beasts that he should meet, for they were of a very different kind than any he had yet seen. And so the young man went on, and by he saw a multitude of very dreadful beasts, ilk ane of them with twa heads, and on every head 4 horns. And he was so frightened, and ran away from them as fast he could. And glad was he when he came to a castle that stood on a hillock, with a door standing wide to the wa, and he gaed into the castle for shelter, and there he saw an auld wife sitting beside the kitchen fire. He asked the wife if he might stay there for the night, as he was tired wi' a lang journey, and the wife said he might, but it was not a good place for him to be in, as it belanged to the Red Aiton, who was a very terrible beast, with 3 heads that spared no living man he could get hold of. The young man would have gone away, but he was afraid of the beasts on the outside of the castle, so he beseeched the old woman to conceal him as well she could, and not to tell the Aiton that there he was. He thought if he could put over the night, he might get away in the morning without meeting with a beast, and so escape. But he had not been long in this hidey-hole before the awful Aiton came in, and nae sooner was he in there than he was heard a-crying, Snook but and snook ben, I find the smell of an earthly man. Be he living or be he dead, his heart this night shall kitchen my bread. Now, in those days the word kitchen meant season, and the monster soon found the poor young man, and pulled him from his hole, and when he had got him out, he told him that if he could answer him 3 questions, his life might be spared. The first was whether Ireland or Scotland was first inhabited. The second was whether man was made for woman or woman for man. The third was whether men or brutes were made first. The lad, not being able to answer one of these questions, the Red Aiton took a mace and knocked him on the head, and turned him into a pillar of stone. On the morning after this happened, the younger brother took out the knife to look at, and he was grieved to find it a brown with rust. He told his mother that the time was now come for him to go away upon his travels also. So she requested him to take the can to the well for water, that she might bake a cake for him. The can being broken, he brought hame as little water as the other had done, and the cake was as little. She asked whether he would have the hale cake with her malison, or the half cake with her blessing. And like his brother, he thought it best to have the hale cake, come the malison what might. So he gaed away, and everything happened to him that what had happened to his brother. The other widow, her son, heard of all that happened frae a fairy, and the young man determined that he would also go upon his travels and see if he could do anything to relieve his twa friends. So his mother gave him a can to go to the well and bring home water, that she might bake him a cake for his journey. And he gaed, and as he was bringing home the water, a raven ower abone his head cried for him to look, and he would see that the water was running out. And he was a young man of sense, and seeing the water running out, he took some clay and patched up the holes, so that he brought home enough water to bake a large cake. When his mother put it to him to take the hay cake with a blessing, he took it in preference to having the whole cake with a malison, and yet the half was bigger than what the other lads had got of that together. So he gaed away on his journey, and after he had travelled a far way, he met with an old woman that asked him if he would give her a bit of his bannock. And he said he would gladly do that, and so he gave her a piece of the bannock, and for that she gave him a magic wand, that she said might yet be of service to him if he took care to use it rightly. Then the old woman, who was fairy, told him a great deal of what would happen to him, and what he ought to do in the circumstances, and after that she vanished in an instant, but out of his sight. He gaed a great way farther, and then he came up to the old man herding the sheep, and when he asked whose sheep these were, the answer was, "The Red Eaton of Ireland, ance lived in Bellygan, and stole King Malcolm's daughter, the King of fair Scotland. He beats her, he binds her, he lays her on a band, and every day he dings her with a bright silver wand. Like Julian the Roman, he's one that fears no man, but now I fear his end is near and destiny at hand, and you're to be, I plainly see, the heir of all his land." The young man then went on his journey, and he had not gone far when he espied another old man with white locks herding a flock of swine, and he gaed up to him and asked whose swine these were, when the man answered, "The Red Eaton of Ireland, ance lived in Bellygan, and stole King Malcolm's daughter, the King of fair Scotland. He beats her, he binds her, he lays her on a band, and every day he dings her with a bright silver wand. Like Julian the Roman, he's one that fears no man, but now I fear his end is near, and destiny at hand, and you're to be, I plainly see, the heir of all his land." Then the young man gaed on a bit further, and came to another very old man herding goats, and when he asked whose goats they were, the answer was, "The Red Eaton of Ireland, ance lived in Bellygan, and stole King Malcolm's daughter, the King of fair Scotland. He beats her, he binds her, he lays her on a band, and every day he dings her with a bright yellow wand. Like Julian the Roman, he's one that fears no man, but now I fear his end is near, and destiny at hand, and you're to be, I plainly see, the heir of all his land." When he came to the place where the monstrous beasts were standing, he did not stop nor run away, but went boldly through among them. One came up roaring with open mouth to devour him, when he struck it with his wand and laid it in an instant dead at his feet. He soon came to the Eaton's castle, where he knocked and was admitted. The old woman that sat by the fire warned him of the terrible Eaton, and what had been the fate of the twa brothers, but he was not to be daunted. The monster soon came in, saying, "Snook but and snook ben, I find the smell of an earthly man, be he living or be he dead. His heart shall be kitchen to my bread." He quickly espied the young man, and bade him come forth on the floor, and then he put the 3 questions to him. But the young man had been told everything by the good fairy, so he was able to answer all the questions. When the Eaton found this, he knew that his power was gone. The young man then took up the axe, and hewed off the monster's 3 heads. He next asked the old woman to shew him where the king's daughters lay, and the old woman took him upstairs and opened a great many doors, and out of every door came a beautiful lady who had been imprisoned there by the Eaton, and ane of the ladies was the king's daughter. She also took him down into a low room, and there stood 2 stone pillars that he had only to touch with a wand, and his 2 friends and neighbours started into life, and the hell of the prisoners were overjoyed at their deliverance, which they all acknowledged to be owing to the prudent young man. Next day they all set out for the king's court, and a gallant company they made, and the king married his daughter to the young man that had delivered her, and gave a noble's daughter to ilk ane of the other young men, and so they aye lived happily the rest of their days. The End. Read by Rick Kistner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The History of Jack the Giant Killer by Old Chapbook. In the reign of the famous King Arthur, there lived in Cornwall a lad named Jack, who was a boy of a bold temper, and took delight in hearing or reading of conjurers, giants, and fairies, and used to listen eagerly to the deeds of the knights of King Arthur's Round Table. In those days there lived on St. Michael's Mount off Cornwall a huge giant, 18 feet high and 9 feet round. His fierce and savage looks were the terror of all who beheld him. He dwelt in a gloomy cavern on top of the mountain, and used to wade over to the mainland in search of prey, where he would throw 6 oxen upon his back, and tie 3 times as many sheep and hogs round his waist, and march back to his own abode. The giant had done this for many years, when Jack resolved to destroy him. Jack took a horn, a shovel, a pickaxe, his armor, and a dark lantern, and one winter's evening he went to the mount. There he dug a pit 22 feet deep and 20 broad. He covered the top over so as to make it look like solid ground. He then blew his horn so loudly that the giant awoke and came out of his den, crying out, "You saucy villain, you shall pay for this. I'll broil you for my breakfast." He had just finished when, taking one step further, he tumbled headlong into the pit, and Jack struck him a blow on the head with his pickaxe, which killed him. Jack then returned home to cheer his friends with the news. Another giant, called Blunderbore, vowed to be revenged on Jack if ever he should have him in his power. This giant kept an enchanted castle in the midst of a lonely wood, and some time after the death of Cormoran, Jack was passing through a wood, and being weary, sat down and went to sleep. The giant, passing by and seeing Jack, carried him to his castle, where he locked him up in a large room, the floor of which was covered with the bodies, skulls, and bones of men and women. Soon after, the giant went to fetch his brother, who was likewise a giant, to take a meal off his flesh, and Jack saw with terror through the bars of his prison the 2 giants approaching. Jack, perceiving in one corner of the room a strong cord, took courage, and making a slip knot at each end, he threw them over their heads and tied it to the window bars. He then pulled till he had choked them. When they were black in the face, he slid down the rope and stabbed them to the heart. Next, Jack took a great bunch of keys from the pocket of Blunderbore and went into the castle again. He made a strict search through all the rooms, and in one of them found 3 ladies tied up by the hair of their heads and almost starved to death. They told him that their husbands had been killed by the giant, who had then condemned them to be starved to death because they would not eat the flesh of their own dead husbands. "Ladies," said Jack, "I have put an end to this monster and his wicked brother, and I give you this castle and all the riches it contains to make some amends for the dreadful pains you have felt." He then very politely gave them the keys of the castle and went further on his journey to Wales. As Jack had but little money, he went on as fast as possible. At length he came to a handsome house. Jack knocked at the door, when there came forth a Welsh giant. Jack said he was a traveller who had lost his way, on which the giant made him welcome, and led him into a room where there was a good bed to sleep in. Jack took off his clothes quickly, but though he was weary, he could not go to sleep. Soon after this he heard the giant walking backward and forward in the next room, and saying to himself, "Though here you lodge with me this night, you shall not see the morning light. My club shall dash your brains out quite." "Say you so?" thought Jack. "Are these your tricks upon travellers? But I hope to prove as cunning as you are." Then getting out of bed, he groped about the room, and at last found a thick, large billet of wood. He laid it in his own place in the bed, and then hid himself in a dark corner of the room. The giant, about midnight, entered the apartment, and with his bludgeon struck many blows on the bed in the very place where Jack had laid the log, and then he went back to his own room, thinking he had broken all Jack's bones. Early in the morning, Jack put a bold face upon the matter, and walked into the giant's room to thank him for his lodging. The giant started when he saw him, and began to stammer out, "Oh, dear me, is it you?" Pray, how did you sleep last night? Did you hear or see anything in the dead of the night?" "Nothing to speak of," said Jack carelessly. "A rat, I believe, gave me 3 or 4 slaps with its tail and disturbed me a little, but I soon went to sleep again." The giant wondered more and more at this, yet he did not answer a word, but went to bring 2 great bowls of hasty pudding for their breakfast. Jack wanted to make the giant believe that he could eat as much as himself, so he contrived to button a leathern bag inside his coat and slipped the hasty pudding into the bag while he seemed to put it into his mouth. When breakfast was over, he said to the giant, "Now I will show you a fine trick. I can cure all wounds with a touch. I could cut off my head in 1 minute, and the next put it sound again on my shoulders. You shall see an example." He then took hold of the knife, ripped up the leathern bag, and all the hasty pudding tumbled out upon the floor. "Od splutter her nails!" cried the Welsh giant, who was ashamed to be outdone by such a little fellow as Jack. "Her can do that herself." So he snatched up the knife, plunged it into his own stomach, and in a moment dropped down dead. Jack, having hitherto been successful in all his undertakings, resolved not to be idle in future. He therefore furnished himself with a horse, a cap of knowledge, a sword of sharpness, shoes of swiftness, and an invisible coat, the better to perform the wonderful enterprises that lay before him. He travelled over high hills, and on the 3rd day he came to a large and spacious forest through which his road lay. Scarcely had he entered the forest when he beheld a monstrous giant dragging along by the hair of their heads a handsome knight and his lady. Jack alighted from his horse, and tying him to an oak tree, put on his invisible coat under which he carried his sword of sharpness. When he came up to the giant, he made several strokes at him, but could not reach his body, but wounded his thighs in several places, and at length, putting both hands to his sword and aiming with all his might, he cut off both his legs. Then Jack, setting his foot upon his neck, plunged his sword into the giant's body, when the monster gave a groan and expired. The knight and his lady thanked Jack for their deliverance, and invited him to their house to receive a proper reward for his services. "No," said Jack, "I cannot be easy till I find out this monster's habitation." So taking the knight's directions, he mounted his horse, and soon after came in sight of another giant, who was sitting on a block of timber waiting for his brother's return. Jack alighted from his horse, and putting on his invisible coat, approached and aimed a blow at the giant's head, but, missing his aim, he only cut off his nose. On this the giant seized his club and laid about him most unmercifully. "Nay," said Jack, "if this be the case, I'd better dispatch you." So jumping upon the block, he stabbed him in the back, whence he dropped down dead. Jack then proceeded on his journey, and travelled over hills and dales, till, arriving at the foot of a high mountain, he knocked at the door of a lonely house, when an old man let him in. When Jack was seated, the hermit thus addressed him, "My son, on the top of this mountain is an enchanted castle kept by the giant Galligantus and a vile magician. I lament the fate of a duke's daughter, whom they seized as she was walking in her father's garden, and brought hither transformed into a deer." Jack promised that in the morning, at the risk of his life, he would break the enchantment, and after a sound sleep he rose early, put on his invisible coat, and got ready for the attempt. When he had climbed to the top of the mountain, he saw 2 fiery griffins, but he passed between them without the least fear of danger, for they could not see him because of his invisible coat. On the castle gate he found a golden trumpet, under which were written these lines, "Whoever can this trumpet blow shall cause the giant's overthrow." As soon as Jack had read this, he seized the trumpet and blew a shrill blast which made the gates fly open and the very castle itself tremble. The giant and the conjurer now knew that their wicked course was at an end, and they stood biting their thumbs and shaking with fear. Jack, with his sword of sharpness, soon killed the giant, and the magician was then carried away by a whirlwind, and every knight and beautiful lady who had been changed into birds and beasts returned to their proper shapes. The castle vanished away like smoke, and the head of the giant Galligantus was then sent to King Arthur. The knights and ladies rested that night at the old man's hermitage, and next day they set out for the court. Jack, then went up to the king and gave his majesty an account of all his fierce battles. Jack's fame had now spread through the whole country, and at the king's desire the duke gave him his daughter in marriage to the joy of all his kingdom. After this the king gave him a large estate on which he and his lady lived the rest of their days in joy and contentment. The end. Read by Rick Kistner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Black Bull of Norroway. And many a hunting song they sung, and song of game and glee, then tuned to plaintive strains their tongue of Scotland's luve and lee. To wilder measures next they turned the black bull of Norroway. Suddenly the taper ceased to burn, the minstrel ceased to play. From The Coot of Kildare by J. Leyden. In Norroway, Langshan, there lived a certain lady, and she had 3 daughters. The oldest of them said to her mither, "Mither, bake me a bannock, and roast me a collop, for I'm going away to see my fortune." Her mither did say, and the doctor gaed away to an old witch washerwife, and telled her purpose. The old wife bade her stay that day, and gang and look out her back door, and see what she could see. She saw nocht the first day, the second day she did the same and saw nocht. On the third day she looked again, and saw a coach and 6 coming along the road. She ran in and telled the old wife what she saw. "Aweel," quo the old wife, "yon's for you." Say they took her into the coach and galloped aff. The second doctor says to her mither, "Mither, bake me a bannock, and roast me a collop, for I'm gone away to seek me fortune." Her mither did say, and awa she gaed to the old wife as her sister had done. On the third day she looked out the back door, and saw a coach and 4 coming along the road. "Aweel," quo the old wife, "yon's for you." Say they took her in, and aff they set. The third doctor says to her mither, "Mither, bake me a bannock, and roast me a collop, for I'm gone awa to see me fortune." Her mither did say, and awa she gaed to the old witch wife. She bade her look out her back door, and see what she could see. She did say, and when she came back, said she saw nocht. The second day she did the same, and saw nocht. The third day she looked again, and on coming back said to her old wife, she saw nocht but a muckle black bull coming roaring alang the road. "Aweel," quo the old wife, "yon's for you." On hearing this, she was next to distracted with grief and terror, but she was lifted up and set on his back, and awa they went. Aye, they travelled, and on they travelled, till the lady grew faint with hunger. "Eat out my right lug," says the black bull, "and drink out my left lug, and set by leavings." Say she did as she said, and was wonderfully refreshed. And lang they gaed, and sair they rade, till they came a sight of a very big and bonny castle. "Yonder we maun be this night," quo the bull, "for me old brother lives yonder." And presently they were at the place. They lifted her aff his back, and took her in, and sent him away to a park for the night. And in the morning, when they brought the bull hame, they took the lady into a fine shining parlour, and gave her a beautiful apple, telling her no to break it till she was in the greatest strait ever mortal was in the world, and that wide bring her out. Again she was lifted on the bull's back, and after she had ridden far, and farther than I can tell, they came in sight of a far bonnier castle, and far farther awa than the last. Says the bull till her, "Yonder we maun be full night, for me stricken brother lives yonder." And when they were at the place directly, they lifted her down and took her in, and sent the bull to the field for the night. And in the morning they took the lady into a fine and rich room, and gave her the finest pear she had ever seen, bidding her no to break it till she was in the greatest strait ever mortal could be in, and that wad to get her out. Again she was lifted and set on his back, and awa they went, and alang they gaed, and sair they rade, till they came in sight of the far biggest castle, and far farthest aff they had yet seen. "We maun be yonder the night," says the bull, "for me young brither lives yonder." And they were there directly. They lifted her down, took her in, and sent the bull to the field for the night. In the morning they took her into a room the finest aye, and gaed her a plum, telling her no to break it till she was in the greatest strait mortal could be in, and that way'd get her out. Presently they brought hame the bull, set the lady on his back, and awa they went. And aye they gaed, and on they rade, till they came to a dark and ugsome glen where they stopped, and the lady lighted down. Says the bull to her, "Here ye maun stay till I gang and fight the deil. Ye maun seat yourself on that stane and move neither hand nor foot till I come back, else I'll never find ye again. And if everything round ye turns blue, I hae beaten the devil. But should if things turn red, he'll have conquered me." She set herself down the stane, and by around her turned blue. O'ercome with joy she lifted the ae foot and crossed it o'er the ither. Sae glad was she that her companion was victorious. The bull returned and sought for, but never could find her. Lang she sat, and aye she grat till she wearied. At last she rase and gaed awa, she kedna whars till. On she wandered till she came to a great hill of glass, that she tried aye she could to climb, but wasna able. Round the bottom of the hill she gaed, sabing and grieving a passage hour, till at last she came to a smith's house, and the smith promised if she wad serve him 7 years, he wad make her iron shoon wherewith she could climb all the glassy hill. At 7 years' end she got her iron shoon, clamb the glassy hill, and chanced to come to the old washerwife's habitation. There she was told of a gallant young knight that had given in some bloody sarks to wash, and whar washed thy sarks was to be his wife. The auld wife had washed till she was tired, and then she set to her dochter, and baith washed, and they better washed, in hope for getting the young knight. But they couldna bring out a stain. At length they set the stranger damosel to work, and whenever she began, the stains came out pure and clean. But the auld wife made the knight believe it was her dochter had washed the sarks. So the knight and the eldest daughter were to be married, and the stranger damosel was distracted at the thought of it, for she was deeply in love with him. So she bethought her of her apple, and breaking it, found it filled with gold and precious jewellery, the richest she had ever seen. "All these," she said to the eldest daughter, "I will give you on condition that you put off your marriage for a day, and allow me to go into his room alone at night." So the lady consented, but meanwhile the auld wife had prepared a sleeping drink and given it to the knight, who drank it and never wakened till next morning. The lelang night, that damosel sobbed and sang, "7 lang years I served for thee, the glassy hill I clamb for thee, the bloody shirt I rang for thee, and wilt thou no waken and turn to me?" Next day she kentna what to do for grief. She then brak the pear, and found it filled with jewellery far richer than the contents of the apple. With thy jewels she bargained for permission to be a second night in the young knight's chamber. But the auld wife gaed him neither slip and drink, and he again slipped till morning. Night she kept sighing and singing as before. 7 lang years I served for thee, etc. Still he sleeped, and she nearly lost hope of the gither. But that day, when he was out at the hunting, somebody asked him what noise and moaning was yon they heard all last night in his bedchamber. He said he heard not only noise, but they assured him there was sae, and he resolved to keep waking that night to try what he could hear. That being the 3rd night, and the damosel being between hope and despair, she brake her plum, and it held far the richest jewellery of the 3. She bargained as before, and the old wife as before took in the sleeping drink to the young knight's chamber. But he told her he couldn't drink it that night without sweetening, and when she gaed away for the money to sweeten it wi', he poured out the drink, and sae made the old wife think he had drunk it. They all went to bed again, and the damosel began as before, singing, 7 lang years I served for thee, the glassy hill I clamb for thee, the bloody shirt I rang for thee, and will thou not waken and turn to me? He heard and turned to her, and she told him that had befallen her, and he told her that had happened to him. And he caused the old washerwife and her dochter to be burned, and they were married, and he and she are living happily to this day for aught I can. The end. Read by Rick Kistner for Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.